Hello there, history enthusiasts and curious minds. Welcome to our exploration of ancient Greece. Specifically, we're going to be gently peeling back the layers of a topic that's often, misunderstood. We're going to be talking about sex. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Ancient Greece, sex, probably just orgies and marble statues, right? It's easy to fall into those simplified images. Hollywood, sensationalist documentaries, they all paint a picture that's, it's not entirely wrong, but it's certainly not the whole story. In fact, one of our main goals today is to gently dismantle some of those myths, to show you that sexuality in ancient Greece wasn't a monolithic block of rampant, activity. It was complex. It was nuanced. It was deeply embedded in their society, their culture, and even their philosophy. Think of it like this. Imagine trying to describe modern sexuality with just a few broad strokes. You'd miss out on so much, wouldn't you? The different attitudes across countries, the changing social norms, the individual experiences. It's the same with ancient Greece. We can't just assume they all thought and behaved the same way. There were variations across different city-states, different social classes, and different time periods. So what can we say for certain? Well, we know that sex was viewed differently back then. Their ideas about gender, relationships, and even the purpose of sex were often different from our own. For example, the concept of homosexuality as a fixed didn't really exist. Instead, they focused more on the roles people played in sexual acts, rather than the gender of their partners. And that's a crucial distinction that we'll be diving into. We also need to understand that procreation was paramount, ensuring the continuation of the family line, providing citizens for the city-state. These were seen as vital duties, and that influenced their attitudes towards marriage, family, and even sexual behavior outside of marriage. But it wasn't all about duty and obligation. The ancient Greeks also celebrated passion. They explored desire in their art, their literature, and their religious rituals. Their mythology is filled with stories of gods and goddesses, engaging in, all sorts of amorous adventures. And these stories, they shaped the way they thought about love, lust, and everything in between. Now, throughout this journey, we'll be encountering some terms and concepts that might feel uncomfortable at first. Things like pederasty, which was a complex relationship between an older man and a younger boy, often involving education and mentorship, alongside sexual elements. We'll approach these topics with sensitivity and respect, always striving to understand them within their historical context. We won't shy away from the difficult aspects, but we'll also avoid sensationalizing or judging them by modern standards. Ultimately, our aim is to paint softly a more complete and nuanced picture of sexuality in ancient Greece, to move beyond the simplistic stereotypes and, dare I say, the salacious headlines, to appreciate the complexity and the contradictions, and to understand how their attitudes towards sex shaped their society and in some ways continue to shape ours. So settle in, get comfortable. Let's gently begin our exploration of this fascinating and often misunderstood aspect of ancient Greek life. It's going to be a calm and insightful journey, I promise. Alright friends, settle in. Let's talk about the Greek gods and goddesses, and the deliciously complicated role they played in shaping views on, everything including sex. It's impossible to understand how the ancient Greeks thought about this topic without acknowledging the colossal influence of their mythology. These weren't some distant, untouchable deities. They were characters, flawed, passionate, dramatic, and often downright, let's just say active. Think of Mount Olympus as the ultimate soap opera, filled with love triangles, scandalous affairs, and enough divine drama to keep mortals entertained and titillated for centuries. Now, at the very heart of this celestial stage, we have Aphrodite, the goddess of love, beauty, and, yes, sexual desire, born, as legend tells us, from the sea foam after Cronus castrated Uranus. Yes, really, Aphrodite embodies the potent, irresistible force of attraction. She wasn't just about soft sunsets and whispered sweet nothings. Aphrodite was about passion, about the undeniable pull that one being feels for another. She wasn't shy about her own desires either. Married to the perpetually unglamorous Hephaestus, the blacksmith god, she carried on numerous affairs, most famously with Ares, the god of war. Their passionate encounters were legendary, and their offspring included Harmonia, the goddess of harmony, and, interestingly, Phobos and Deimos, the personifications of fear and terror. Perhaps a nod to the messy consequences of illicit love. But Aphrodite is just the tip of the iceberg. Zeus, the king of the gods, now he was a busy man. His marital vows to Hera, more like loose suggestions. He was notorious for his countless affairs with both goddesses and mortal women, often resorting to elaborate disguises to woo his chosen targets. He transformed himself into a bull to abduct Europa, a shower of gold to seduce and even a swan to, well, you get the picture. These stories, while entertaining, served a purpose. They normalized the idea of powerful figures giving in to their desires, and they highlighted the potential for anyone, regardless of their status, to be swept away by lust. And what about the other gods? Dionysus, the god of wine, revelry, and fertility, presided over orgiastic festivals where inhibitions were shed and boundaries blurred. These weren't just drunken parties, they were sacred rituals, a way to connect with the divine through ecstatic experiences. The Maenads, his female followers, were known for their wild dances, their consumption of wine, and their willingness to embrace their primal instincts. Even seemingly chaste deities weren't immune to the influence of erotic mythology. Artemis, the goddess of the hunt and the moon, was often depicted surrounded by nymphs, female spirits of nature, while she herself was a virgin goddess. The imagery surrounding her suggested a strong connection to female bonds and a celebration of the beauty and freedom of the female form. So how did all this rampant divine activity affect the everyday lives of ancient Greeks? Well, for one, it instilled a certain acceptance of human desires. If the gods themselves were indulging in all sorts of shenanigans, who were mortals to deny their own impulses? The myths provided a framework for understanding the complexities of love, lust, and relationships. They offered cautionary tales, like the story of Narcissus, who was so obsessed with his own reflection that he wasted away and died, reminding people about the dangers of unchecked vanity. But they also celebrated the power of love, like the story of Eros and Psyche, who overcame numerous obstacles to be together, showing the transformative potential of true affection. Furthermore, the pervasive presence of erotic imagery in art and literature played a crucial role in shaping societal views. Pottery was adorned with scenes of courtship, lovemaking, and even more explicit acts. Sculptures celebrated the beauty of the human body, both male and female, in all its glory. Literature, from Homer's epics to Sappho's poems, explored the nuances of desire and the complexities of human relationships. This constant exposure to erotic themes helped to desensitize people to nudity and sexuality, making it a more natural and accepted part of life. Now, it's important to remember that this doesn't mean ancient Greek society was some kind of free-for-all. There were still rules and expectations, especially for women, as we'll explore later. But the mythology provided a foundation for a more nuanced and open-minded approach to sexuality than we might expect. Think about it. The gods weren't perfect role models, far from it, but their stories, their passions, their flaws, all contributed to a cultural landscape where human desire was acknowledged, explored, and even celebrated. It wasn't about blindly following the gods' example, but rather understanding the powerful forces at play within themselves, within each other, and within the world around them. The myths weren't just stories, they were reflections of the human condition, writ large on the canvas of the cosmos. They offered a framework for understanding the complexities of love, lust, jealousy, and desire, reminding us that even the most powerful beings are ultimately driven by the same primal urges that we all experience. And that, my friends, is a pretty powerful influence indeed. So next time you see a statue of Aphrodite, or read a story about Zeus's latest conquest, remember that you're not just looking at a piece of art or reading a myth, you're glimpsing a window into the ancient Greek psyche, a world where the gods were as passionate, flawed, and undeniably human as we are. Alright, settle in friends, let's delve into something a little more complex. We're going to explore male-male relationships in ancient Greece, specifically a practice known as pederasty. Now, I know that word can conjure up some strong images, and it's important to approach this topic with sensitivity and a nuanced understanding. We're not here to judge the past by modern standards, but rather to try and understand the social context in which these relationships existed. First off, the word itself, pederasty, comes from the Greek words paidos, meaning boy, and arestes, meaning lover. But crucially, it wasn't simply about sexual gratification, it was far more layered than that. Think of it as a socially accepted, and even encouraged, mentorship between an older man, the arestes, and a younger male, the eromenos. This wasn't just some casual fling, it was a formalized relationship, often within the elite circles of Greek society. The arestes would typically be a mature man, in his late 20s or 30s, someone of established standing within the community. The eromenos, on the other hand, would be an adolescent, usually between the ages of 12 and 17, from a similarly privileged background. The relationship wasn't viewed as being purely, or even primarily sexual. Its most important aspect was the arestes' role as an educator and mentor. The arestes would guide the eromenos in matters of philosophy, politics, warfare, and even everyday life. He was essentially shaping him into a virtuous and capable citizen. Imagine it like a very intensive apprenticeship, where the older man isn't just teaching a trade, but instilling moral values and leadership skills. He would introduce the eromenos to important social circles, help him navigate the complex world of Athenian politics, and provide a role model for him to emulate. It was a way of passing down knowledge and traditions from one generation to the next. The eromenos, in turn, was expected to offer the arestes respect, admiration, and, well, affection. His beauty and potential were seen as an inspiration to the arestes, motivating him to act with honor and integrity. Think of it as a symbiotic relationship, where both parties benefited from the connection. Now, regarding the physical aspect of these relationships, it's difficult to ascertain the precise nature and frequency of sexual contact. Some scholars believe that sexual activity was limited or even non-existent in some cases, focusing instead on emotional and intellectual intimacy. Others argue that physical intimacy was an accepted, though regulated, part of the relationship, often involving non-penetrative acts. The specific practices probably varied depending on the individuals involved, the city-state, and the time period. It's important to remember that the Greeks had different conceptions of sexuality than we do today. They didn't necessarily categorize people as strictly homosexual or heterosexual. Instead, they focused more on the active and passive roles within sexual relationships. The arestes, as the older dominant partner, was typically seen as the active participant, while the eromenos was the passive one. And ideally, once the eromenos came of age, he would then take on the arestes' role with a younger boy. There were definitely societal expectations and norms that governed these relationships. For instance, it was considered shameful for the eromenos to be motivated purely by material gain. The relationship was ideally based on mutual respect and admiration, not just a desire for gifts or social advancement. And, crucially, Once the Eromenos reached adulthood and became a citizen, the pederastic relationship was expected to end. He would then be expected to marry and have children. The social status of both individuals was also a key factor. Pederasty was primarily practiced among the elite classes, who had the time and resources to dedicate to this kind of intensive mentorship. It was seen as a way of reinforcing social hierarchies and ensuring that future leaders were properly educated and prepared. Now, it's also worth mentioning that these relationships weren't always viewed positively by everyone in ancient Greece. Some philosophers, like Aristotle, expressed concerns about the potential for abuse and the disruption of traditional family structures. And indeed, it's important to acknowledge that the power dynamics inherent in these relationships could have led to exploitation in some cases. We can't paint a picture that's entirely rosy, of course, but overall, pederasty, in its ideal form, was seen as a valuable social institution that contributed to the education and moral development of young men, and to the stability and prosperity of the city-state. It was an integral part of their understanding of citizenship, education, and social order. It offered an opportunity for younger citizens to be molded into responsible and honorable leaders of their community. And that mentorship played a key role in the social and political life of ancient Greece. So when we consider male-male relationships in ancient Greece, it's essential to look beyond the modern lens and try to understand the complex social and cultural context in which they existed. It wasn't just about sex, it was about education, mentorship, social status, and the transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next. It was a unique phenomenon that shaped the lives of many ancient Greek citizens, and it offers us a fascinating glimpse into a world that was both similar to and vastly different from our own. I hope you feel more informed and maybe a little more relaxed now. That's all for this time. Alright, settle in, friends. Let's dim the lights just a tad more. We're drifting now into a world of whispers and blooming affection, a world centered on the island of Lesbos, and most importantly, the poet Sappho. Now, when we talk about same-sex relationships in ancient Greece, our minds often jump straight to the well-documented, if sometimes misunderstood, dynamics between men. But the story of female affection is equally fascinating, and it largely revolves around this one extraordinary woman. Sappho, you see, wasn't just any poet, she was a sensation. Think of her as, well, the ancient world's biggest pop star, but instead of catchy tunes, she crafted lyrical poems filled with longing, desire, and deeply felt emotion. And the subjects of these poems, almost exclusively, other women. We don't know a ton about her life with absolute certainty. Time has a way of blurring the details, leaving us with fragments and interpretations. But what is clear from her surviving work is that she ran a thyasos, a sort of finishing school or cultural circle, on Lesbos for young women. Imagine it as a space where young women would come to learn poetry, music, dance, and the arts, all under Sappho's tutelage. Now, the specifics of the relationships within this thyasos are of course open to interpretation. We can't just assume from a modern perspective that every poem about love and longing automatically equals a physical relationship. But what is evident is the profound emotional intimacy, the deep bonds of affection, and the intense feelings of admiration and desire that permeated these relationships. Sappho's poems are filled with vivid descriptions of the beauty of these young women, the way their voices sound, the way their laughter rings out. She writes of physical sensations, a racing heart, trembling limbs, when in their presence. She captures the bittersweet pain of separation when these young women eventually left to marry. And this is where things get a little complicated. Were these relationships purely platonic friendships, intense mentor-student bonds, or something more physically intimate? Well, honestly, we can't say for sure. The ancient Greeks themselves didn't always neatly categorize sexuality the way we do today. The very idea of distinct homosexual and heterosexual identities is a relatively modern construct. What mattered more to them, it seems, was the nature of the relationship, the roles played within it, and the context in which it occurred. Think of it this way: in male-male relationships, as we'll discuss, there was often a clear power dynamic between the older Erastes, the lover, and the younger Eromenos, the beloved. But in Sappho's circle, these power dynamics were less clearly defined, or perhaps existed in a different way. It was a space where women could express affection and desire for each other, free from the constraints and expectations of the patriarchal society that surrounded them. The island of Lesbos, of course, became inextricably linked with female same-sex affection because of Sappho. In fact, that's where we get the word lesbian, from the island itself. But it's important to remember that Sappho wasn't just a symbol. She was a real woman, a poet, a teacher, who created a space for female connection and self-expression. The legacy of Sappho is therefore very multi-layered. On the one hand, it's a clear historic marker for the development of female queer expression. On the other hand, it's so rooted in myth, lost works and speculation that it represents a frustratingly obscured look at female identity. We also need to consider that, like any historical figure, Sappho has been reinterpreted and redefined throughout history. Over the centuries, some scholars have attempted to downplay or even deny the erotic nature of her poems, arguing that they were simply expressions of female friendship. Others have embraced the more overtly sexual interpretations, seeing Sappho as a trailblazer of female sexuality. The truth, as is often the case, likely lies somewhere in the middle. Sappho's poems are complex and multifaceted, open to different readings and interpretations. What's undeniable is that they offer a rare glimpse into the world of female relationships in ancient Greece, a world that is often overlooked or marginalized in historical accounts. But there is something else to consider: the context in which these relationships existed. In a society where women's lives were largely confined to the domestic sphere, the Thaisos offered a space for intellectual and emotional growth, a place where women could connect with each other, share their thoughts and feelings, and develop their talents. Imagine the freedom of that, even within the limitations of ancient Greek society, a space where women could be themselves, express their desires, and form deep and lasting bonds with one another. That's the legacy of Sappho and her circle on Lesbos, a legacy of female friendship, affection, and perhaps even love, a legacy that continues to resonate today. So let's hold on to that image for a moment. The gentle waves lapping against the shores of Lesbos, the sound of lyres and female voices blending in the air, the scent of flowers and olive oil. A world away, and yet, somehow, still so close. Now breathe deeply, and let's drift on. Marriage and procreation, these are cornerstones of any society, and ancient Greece was certainly no exception. But as with everything in this fascinating world, the details are what truly captivate. So let's gently delve into the world of marriage in ancient Greece, focusing especially on the expectations placed upon women within this institution. Think of marriage, first and foremost, as a social and economic contract. It wasn't really about romantic love, at least not initially. Of course, affection could blossom over time, but the primary purpose was to ensure the continuation of the family line, to produce legitimate heirs who would inherit property and carry on the family name. It was also about forging alliances between families, consolidating power, and ensuring the stability of the city-state. These considerations, you see, were paramount. Now for the women, well, their role in this grand scheme was quite specific, wasn't it? A woman's primary duty upon marriage was to bear children, preferably male. Sons were essential for continuing the family lineage, participating in civic life, and defending the city-state. Daughters, while valued, didn't hold quite the same level of importance from this perspective. The pressure to produce a male heir could be immense, and a woman's worth was often measured by her fertility and her ability to deliver healthy sons. Can you imagine that kind of pressure? The age at which women married also differed significantly from what we might consider normal today. Girls could be married as young as 14 or 15, sometimes even younger, while their husbands were typically older, perhaps in their late 20s or early 30s. This age gap reflects the expectation that the husband would be the more experienced and dominant partner in the relationship. It also meant that young girls were entering into a world of adulthood, often with limited experience of the world outside their immediate family. Arrangements were usually made by the fathers of the bride and groom. The bride had little, if any, say in the matter. Her family would negotiate a dowry, which consisted of property or money that the bride brought into the marriage. This dowry served as a form of security for the wife. Should the marriage dissolve, she would be entitled to its return. It was a crucial safeguard in a society where women had limited legal rights of their own. So, what was expected of women besides childbearing? Well, domestic duties, naturally. Managing the household was a woman's domain. This included overseeing the servants, preparing food, weaving cloth, and generally ensuring the smooth running of the home. For wealthier families, this might involve supervising a large staff and managing significant resources. For poorer families, it meant much harder work, with the woman performing many of the tasks herself. In terms of societal expectations, a woman was expected to be modest, chaste, and obedient. Her reputation was incredibly important, and any hint of scandal could bring shame upon her entire family. She was expected to remain within the confines of the home, largely invisible to the outside world. Public appearances were limited, and she was typically accompanied by a male relative when venturing out. Think about the contrast here. Men engaged in politics, warfare, and philosophical discussions, while women were largely confined to the domestic sphere, their lives centered around the home and family. It was a very different world for men and women, wasn't it? Now, it's important to note that there were variations across different city-states. For example, in Sparta, women enjoyed a greater degree of freedom and physical training compared to their Athenian counterparts. Spartan women were encouraged to be strong and healthy, as this was believed to produce stronger offspring. However, even in Sparta, their primary role remained that of motherhood and ensuring the continuation of the Spartan warrior tradition. Of course, not all women necessarily conformed to these expectations. There were undoubtedly women who chafed under these restrictions, who sought greater autonomy and influence. We might catch glimpses of these women in literature and historical accounts, hinting at a more complex reality than the idealized picture often presented. It's also worth mentioning the role of wet nurses. For wealthier families, it was common to hire wet nurses to breastfeed their babies. This allowed the mother to resume her other duties more quickly and potentially conceive again sooner, further fulfilling her role in procreation. It also highlights the social stratification of the time, where wealthier families could afford to delegate certain aspects of child care. Marriage ceremonies themselves varied, but they typically involved religious rituals, processions, and feasts. The bride would be escorted from her family's home to her husband's home, symbolizing her transition into a new family unit. These ceremonies were important social events, reinforcing the bonds between families and solidifying the new marriage. And finally, let's not forget the emotional aspect, or rather, the potential lack thereof. While romantic love wasn't the primary reason for marriage, it could certainly develop over time. However, the power imbalance between husband and wife often meant that the woman was in a vulnerable position, dependent on her husband for her well-being and social standing. It's a complex web of expectations, duties, and sometimes, perhaps, a glimmer of something more. It leaves us to wonder about the inner lives and personal aspirations of these women, so often overshadowed by the demands of society. And that in itself is a very thought-provoking thing to consider, isn't it? Alright, let's dim the lights a little, settle in, and talk about the lives of women in ancient Greece. It's a story of limited agency, of societal expectations that were often incredibly restrictive. And it's important to remember that when we talk about ancient Greece, we're really talking about city-states, primarily Athens, because that's where we get most of our information. But life varied across the Greek world. Still, certain common threads ran through the experiences of most women. Now, to be clear, there were no blanket rights as we understand them today for anyone, really, but especially not for women. They were largely excluded from the political sphere. Forget voting, forget holding office. Public life was generally a male domain. Women's roles were primarily defined by their relationship to men, as daughters, wives, and mothers. Their value was often tied to their ability to bear children, preferably sons, to continue the family line and inherit property. Think of it this way: a woman's life often revolved around the okos, the household. Within that sphere she held considerable responsibility, managing the domestic affairs, overseeing slaves, and caring for the children. But that was largely the extent of her power. She might be responsible for weaving, for food preparation, for ensuring the smooth running of the household economy, but she wasn't making decisions about war, about politics, about, well, anything outside those walls, really. Education was another area where women faced significant limitations. While some women, especially in wealthier families, might receive some basic instruction at home, reading, writing, perhaps music, it was nowhere near the level afforded to boys. Boys went on to attend schools, to study philosophy, rhetoric, and mathematics. Women, not so much. This lack of education severely limited their opportunities and reinforced their dependence on men. This isn't to say there weren't exceptions, of course. There were always women who defied expectations, who found ways to exert influence, to leave their mark. But these were exceptions that proved the rule. And again, we have to acknowledge our source bias. Most of what we know comes from male writers, from playwrights, from historians, who naturally saw the world through a male lens. So we have to be careful about accepting their narratives at face value. Another key aspect of women's lives was marriage. Marriages were generally arranged by the fathers of the bride and groom, often with economic or political considerations in mind. Love was rarely the primary factor. A young woman might be betrothed in her early teens and married shortly thereafter, often to a man much older than herself. This created a significant power imbalance from the outset. The primary purpose of marriage, as mentioned before, was procreation. Wives were expected to bear children, ideally sons, to ensure the continuation of the family. Childbirth was of course a dangerous undertaking, and many women died in childbirth. Beyond bearing children, wives were expected to be faithful and obedient to their husbands, to manage the household, and to maintain a good reputation. Social interactions for women were also heavily restricted. They were often discouraged from going out in public unaccompanied. If they did venture out, they might be veiled or accompanied by slaves. Public gatherings, such as the symposium, a kind of all-male drinking party, were generally off-limits. Women's social lives were largely confined to the domestic sphere, to interactions with other women within the household or among family and close friends. Laws, too, reflected the unequal status of women. Women couldn't own property independently, couldn't represent themselves in court, and couldn't make legal contracts. Their legal rights were mediated through their male guardians, their fathers, husbands, or male relatives. In cases of divorce, which was possible, the woman's dowry would typically be returned to her family, but she would often have little recourse if she was mistreated or abandoned. Now, it's tempting to paint a uniformly bleak picture of women's lives in ancient Greece. And certainly, there were profound inequalities and restrictions, but it's also important to avoid romanticizing the past. While women faced significant challenges, they were not simply passive victims. They exerted influence within the domestic sphere, they formed strong bonds with other women, and they found ways to navigate the limitations imposed upon them. For example, religious festivals often provided opportunities for women to participate in public life, to express their devotion, and to connect with other women. Some women, particularly those from aristocratic families, might have received a better education and enjoyed more social freedom. And as we'll discuss later, certain groups of women, such as the hetairai, occupied a unique and often surprisingly influential position in society. Ultimately, understanding the lives of women in ancient Greece requires us to grapple with the complexities of a patriarchal society, to acknowledge the limitations and inequalities they faced, but also to recognize their agency, their resilience, and their contributions to their families and communities. It's a nuanced and often unsettling story, but one that's essential to understanding the full picture of ancient Greek society. Alright, let's delve into the captivating world of the Hetairai, women who occupied a truly unique space in ancient Greek society. When we think of women in ancient Greece, often the image that comes to mind is one of domesticity, limited freedom, and a life largely confined to the home. But the Hetairai offer a fascinating counterpoint to this general perception. The word Hetaira literally translates to female companion, but their role was far more complex than simply being a friend. They were essentially highly sophisticated courtesans, but the term courtesan feels almost inadequate to describe their multifaceted lives. These women were educated, independent, and wielded a surprising degree of social influence. So what set them apart? Well, unlike the wives of Athenian citizens, who were often expected to remain largely uneducated and focused on domestic duties, the Hetairai received a comprehensive education. Think of it like this: the average women stayed at home while the Hetairai were off to college. They studied literature, philosophy, music, and even politics. They were trained in the art of conversation, wit, and charm, making them stimulating intellectual partners. They weren't just beautiful faces, they were sharp minds, capable of engaging in complex discussions with the leading thinkers of their time. This education was crucial. It allowed them to move in circles that were typically off-limits to other women. They attended symposia, those famous drinking parties where men gathered to discuss philosophy, politics, and just about everything. While wives were certainly not invited, Hetairai were welcome, and even expected to contribute to the intellectual discourse. Imagine being the only woman in a room full of men, but having the knowledge and wit to not only hold your own, but to truly shine. That was the power of a Hetaira. Now, this level of education, unsurprisingly, wasn't accessible to all women. It typically came at a price, often requiring some level of financial independence or a family that recognized the value of educating their daughters. Some Hetairai were born into wealth, while others may have acquired it through their own talents and connections. Beyond education, another key aspect of the Hetairai's lives was their relative independence. Unlike married women, they weren't under the direct control of a husband or male guardian. They managed their own finances, made their own decisions, and were free to choose their own partners. Of course, this independence came with its own set of challenges and social stigmas, but it was still a significant departure from the traditional role of women in ancient Greece. And about those social stigmas, it's important to remember that while Hetairai enjoyed a certain level of prestige and influence, they were still considered outside the boundaries of respectable Athenian society. There was a clear distinction between a Hetaira and a wife, and the two roles were not interchangeable. Hetairai were not expected to be chaste or faithful, and their relationships were often more about intellectual and social connection than romantic love. One of the most famous Hetairai was Aspasia, the companion of Pericles, one of the most influential statesmen in Athenian history. She was renowned for her intelligence, her political acumen, and her ability to attract some of the brightest minds in Athens to her salon. She was said to have influenced Pericles' policies, and to have played a significant role in Athenian intellectual life. While sources differ on the exact nature of their relationship, there's no doubt that Aspasia was a powerful and influential figure. It is often argued that she ran the equivalent of an Ivy League institution out of her house. Another notable Hetaira was Phryne, a celebrated beauty who served as a model for many famous sculptors. Stories about Phryne are numerous and sometimes contradictory, but they all paint a picture of a woman who was confident, independent, and aware of her own worth. One famous anecdote tells of how she was put on trial for impiety, and when her lawyer realized that his arguments weren't swaying the jury, he dramatically revealed her breasts, causing the jurors to acquit her out of awe and respect for her beauty. Now, whether that story is entirely true is debatable, but it speaks to the power and allure that hetairai could possess. The influence of the hetairai extended beyond the individual relationships they formed. They also played a role in shaping cultural norms and attitudes. By challenging traditional expectations of women, they helped to expand the boundaries of what was considered acceptable and possible for women in ancient Greek society. Their presence at symposia, their participation in intellectual discussions, and their patronage of the arts helped to elevate the status of women in general, even if only incrementally. It's also important to remember that the lives of hetairai were not without their challenges. They faced social prejudice, and their livelihoods were often precarious. They were dependent on the patronage of wealthy men, and their status could change depending on the whims of their clients. They were also vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. However, despite these challenges, the hetairai carved out a unique and significant place for themselves in ancient Greek society. They were more than just courtesans, they were intellectuals, artists and influencers who played a vital role in shaping the cultural landscape of their time. Their stories offer a fascinating glimpse into a world where women could exercise a degree of agency and independence that was rare for their time. So the next time you hear about ancient Greece, remember the hetairai and their contributions to this historic society. Alright, settle in friends, let's dim the lights a little and talk about pornai. In ancient Greece, while marriage was all about producing legitimate heirs and maintaining the household, well, let's just say desires didn't always stay within those walls. And where there's desire, there's often a market, and that market was served by the pornai, the prostitutes of ancient Greece. Now the word pornai itself is a bit blunt. It literally translates to those who are sold. It's a stark reminder of the transactional nature of this profession, and it speaks volumes about the societal view of these women. We're not talking about the celebrated hetairai here, those educated and independent courtesans who could charm with wit and intellect. Pornai occupied a different, lower rung on the social ladder, existing primarily for sexual gratification. The experiences of pornai were incredibly varied. Imagine a spectrum, stretching from dimly lit, bustling brothels to solitary streetwalkers, each woman navigating her own path within a complex social system. At one end, you'd find the dikaiazine, the higher-class prostitutes, often foreign women, who might have operated in or near the pandokan, the taverns and inns. These establishments sometimes functioned as clandestine brothels, offering a degree of privacy and anonymity. Picture cramped rooms, the air thick with the scent of cheap wine and perfume, the murmur of voices a constant backdrop. Life here was probably precarious, with competition fierce and the threat of exploitation ever present. Then you have the aulatrides, who were flute girls. These girls would perform at symposia or private parties. It was not uncommon for the aulatrides to also offer sexual services to patrons. This was one way for a girl to make a living with music and dance. At the other end of the spectrum were the pornai epador, the prostitutes by the road, or the streetwalkers. These women, often the most vulnerable, plied their trade in public spaces, near the agora, the harbour, or even outside the city gates. They might have been enslaved, abandoned, or simply driven to this life by economic hardship. Imagine the daily struggle for survival, the exposure to the elements, the constant risk of violence, and the lack of any real protection. Brothels in ancient Greece, often called oikotai, were usually privately owned and operated. Archaeological evidence, though limited, points to their existence in various Greek cities, particularly port cities like Corinth, known for its thriving sex trade. The conditions within these brothels likely varied, from squalid and exploitative to perhaps slightly more organized and regulated, but we're still talking about a pretty rough existence. The legal framework surrounding prostitution in ancient Greece is hazy to say the least. There weren't specific laws explicitly prohibiting prostitution, but there were regulations regarding public decency and the conduct of citizens. Brothel owners, for instance, might have been subject to certain taxes or licensing requirements. And while prostitution itself wasn't strictly illegal, there was a stigma attached to it. particularly for citizens. A freeborn Greek citizen woman engaging in prostitution would face severe social repercussions, damaging her reputation and that of her family. One particularly interesting facet of prostitution in ancient Greece is its connection to religion. In some cities like Corinth, prostitution was linked to the worship of Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. The Temple of Aphrodite in Corinth was said to have employed thousands of hierodoloi, temple prostitutes, as part of its religious rituals. These women were dedicated to the goddess, and their earnings went towards the upkeep of the temple. This association with religious practice, while perhaps offering a degree of legitimacy, also underscores the commodification of female sexuality in ancient Greek society. Now, it's important to remember that our understanding of pornai comes primarily from literary sources, particularly comedies and philosophical texts. These sources, often written by men, offer a skewed and often biased perspective. Comedies, for instance, frequently portray pornai as objects of ridicule or targets of satire, reinforcing negative stereotypes. Philosophical texts, while sometimes more nuanced, tend to focus on the moral implications of prostitution rather than the lived experiences of the women themselves. Consequently, it's difficult to get a complete and accurate picture of what life was really like for pornai. We can piece together fragments of information from archaeological finds, inscriptions, and legal documents, but the voices of these women themselves are largely silent. It's also crucial to avoid romanticizing or glorifying prostitution in ancient Greece. While some scholars argue that it provided a degree of economic independence for certain women, the reality was likely far more complex and often exploitative. Pornai were vulnerable to abuse, disease, and social ostracism. Their lives were often short and marked by hardship. So, as we reflect on the pornai of ancient Greece, let's remember them not just as nameless figures in historical texts, but as individuals who, despite the constraints of their society, were navigating their own paths, making difficult choices, and striving for survival in a world that often offered them very little. It's a complex story, one that reminds us that history is never simple, and that even in the most ancient of societies, the human experience is full of nuance and, well, quiet desperation. Alright, settle in everyone, because in this section we're going to delve into the fascinating and sometimes surprising attitudes the ancient Greeks held toward the human body. It's a perspective quite different from our own, and understanding it is key to understanding their views on, well, everything. One of the most striking differences is their approach to nudity. While modern Western societies often associate nudity with sexuality or shame, the ancient Greeks saw it quite differently. In many contexts, it was simply normal, and it wasn't just accepted, it was often celebrated, especially for men. Let's start with art. If you've ever visited a museum with a collection of Greek sculptures, you've undoubtedly noticed the prevalence of nude figures. Gods, heroes, athletes, all frequently depicted without clothing. Now, this wasn't simply artistic license or a desire to titillate, it was a reflection of their values. The male nude, in particular, was seen as embodying ideal beauty, strength, and civic virtue. Sculptors like Phidias and Praxiteles strove to capture perfect proportions and musculature, showcasing the human form at its most magnificent. Think of the Doryphorus, or Spear Bearer, by Polykleitos. It's a perfect example. This sculpture wasn't just a depiction of a man, it was a statement about the ideal citizen, strong, capable, and beautiful. These weren't just pretty statues to look at either. They served a purpose. They were displayed in public spaces, reminding citizens of the values they were meant to uphold. They were also offerings to the gods, a way of presenting the best of humanity to the divine. The female nude was far less common in early Greek art, particularly in sculpture. When it did appear, it was often associated with goddesses, such as Aphrodite, representing beauty, love, and fertility. The most famous example is perhaps the Aphrodite of Cnidos by Praxiteles, which was considered revolutionary for its time. We'll talk about Aphrodite again, but that's for another section. Now let's move on to athletics. This is where things get really interesting. The Olympic Games, the most famous sporting event in the ancient world, were held in the nude. Yes, you heard that right. Athletes competed completely naked. And it wasn't just the Olympics. Nudity was the norm in virtually all athletic contests. Think about the logic behind it. They believed clothing would be a hindrance to peak performance. They wanted to show off their physique, demonstrating the result of dedicated training and discipline. It was also a way of equalizing the playing field, both literally and figuratively. Nudity stripped away any potential advantage one athlete might have over another, focusing purely on skill and physical prowess. But there's more to it than just that. Athletic events were seen as a religious ritual, a way of honoring the gods through physical excellence. Nudity, in this context, was a form of purity and a way of connecting with the divine. And the spectators? Well, they were there to admire the athletic skill and physical beauty on display. It was a collective celebration of the human body and its capabilities. Of course, this wasn't just a free-for-all. There were rules and regulations. Athletes were expected to maintain a certain level of decorum and respect. And naturally, women were not allowed to compete in the nude in the main Olympic events, or even watch. They had their own separate games, called the Heraean Games, dedicated to the goddess Hera, and the details of their attire, or lack thereof, are less clearly documented. Finally, let's touch on religious rituals. Nudity sometimes played a role in certain religious practices, particularly those associated with fertility and Dionysus, the god of wine, revelry, and, well, let's just say, unrestrained behavior. These rituals were often ecstatic and involved communal dancing, music, and sometimes even drinking and sexual activity. Nudity, in this context, symbolized a stripping away of societal constraints and a connection with the raw primal forces of nature. It was a way of surrendering oneself to the divine and experiencing a sense of unity with the cosmos. Now, it's important to remember that these attitudes were not universal throughout ancient Greece. Different city-states had different customs and norms. For example, Spartan society, known for its militaristic focus, placed a strong emphasis on physical fitness and discipline. Spartan women, unlike their Athenian counterparts, were encouraged to participate in athletic activities, often with minimal clothing, to promote physical strength and healthy reproduction. This was quite shocking for the rest of Greece. Also, it's important not to romanticize or idealize ancient Greek attitudes towards the body. There were certainly inequalities and double standards. As we discussed, women faced greater restrictions and were often viewed through a lens of domesticity and procreation. And while male nudity was often celebrated, there were still societal expectations and norms that governed its expression. In conclusion, the ancient Greeks had a complex and nuanced relationship with the human body. Nudity, in art, athletics and religious rituals, was not simply about sexuality or shame. It was about beauty, strength, virtue, religious devotion, and a connection with the natural world. By understanding these attitudes, we can gain a deeper appreciation for the values and beliefs of this fascinating civilization, and hopefully get a little sleepy learning about it. Let's delve into the fascinating world of erotic art and literature in ancient Greece. It's a topic that offers a surprisingly candid and often humorous glimpse into their perspectives on sex, desire, and the human form. Prepare yourself because it's about to get a little steamy. But you know, in a historical and educational way, pottery, in particular, is a treasure trove of information. Think about it. These weren't just everyday items, they were decorated with scenes from daily life, mythology, and yes, explicit sexual encounters. Imagine a symposium, a drinking party, where guests are reclining, enjoying wine, and casually glancing at the artwork adorning their drinking cups. What might they have seen? Well, let's start with the basics. Scenes of heterosexual intercourse were common, often depicted with a straightforwardness that might surprise us today. The figures are typically idealized, athletic bodies, reflecting the Greek obsession with physical perfection. But it's not always just about the act itself. Sometimes the artists capture the playful anticipation, the tender intimacy, or even the humorous awkwardness of these moments. And then there are the scenes of male-male encounters. Now, remember what we discussed earlier about pederasty. It's crucial to understand the cultural context here. These images aren't simply about lust, they often depict the relationship between an older Orestes and a younger Eromenos. The scenes might show the older man gifting the younger one with a rooster, a common symbol of courtship, or depict them engaged in athletic pursuits. The artwork often seeks to capture the beauty, admiration, and mentorship inherent in the relationship. However, it's important to acknowledge that the interpretation of these images is complex and contested. We can't simply project modern sensibilities onto them. Some scholars argue that certain depictions might reflect power dynamics and social hierarchies, even exploitation. It's a reminder that even in art, we need to be mindful of the potential for imbalance and coercion. Beyond the act of sex itself, Greek pottery also offers a window into their broader attitudes toward nudity. Nudity wasn't necessarily seen as shameful or inherently sexual. In fact, it was often associated with purity, athleticism, and even religious ritual. Think about the athletes competing nude in the Olympic Games. Their bodies were seen as symbols of strength, discipline, and the pursuit of excellence. This reverence for the human form is reflected in the idealized bodies that grace so much of Greek art. Sculpture, of course, provides another avenue for exploring Greek eroticism. The sculptures of Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, are prime examples. These statues, often depicted nude or semi-nude, celebrate the female form and embody ideals of feminine grace and allure. Think of the famous Aphrodite of Cnidus, one of the most celebrated sculptures of antiquity. It was considered so captivating that stories circulated about men falling madly in love with the statue. Male sculptures, too, often exuded a powerful sensuality. Think of the Doryphorus by Polykleitos, also known as the spear bearer. It's a perfect example of the Greek ideal of male beauty, a harmonious balance of strength, proportion, and athletic prowess. While not explicitly erotic, the sculpture's careful attention to anatomical detail and the idealized form evoke a sense of admiration and desire. Now, let's turn to literature. Greek literature, from epic poetry to plays and philosophical dialogues, is filled with stories of love, lust, and desire. The Iliad and the Odyssey, for example, are replete with tales of gods and mortals engaging in affairs, battling over beautiful women, and experiencing the full spectrum of human emotions. But perhaps the most explicitly erotic literature comes from the genre of love poetry. Sappho, the poet from the island of Lesbos, is the most famous example. Her poems, though fragmented, offer a powerful glimpse into the passionate relationships between women. Her verses celebrate the beauty, desire, and emotional intensity of female love, forever linking her name with same-sex affection. The plays of Aristophanes, the master of comedy, also provide valuable insights. His plays are often bawdy and irreverent, filled with sexual innuendo, double entendres, and satirical commentary on social mores. They show us that the Greeks weren't afraid to laugh about sex, to poke fun at its absurdities, and to explore its complexities through humor. It's important to remember that this isn't a monolithic perspective. Views on sex and sexuality varied across different regions, social classes, and time periods within ancient Greece. What might have been acceptable in Athens might have been frowned upon in Sparta, and vice versa. So what can we conclude from all of this? The erotic art and literature of ancient Greece offer a complex and multifaceted picture of their views on sex and desire. They weren't prudish or repressed, they were open to exploring the full range of human emotions and experiences. While their attitudes might seem shocking or even disturbing to us today, it's crucial to understand them within their own historical and cultural context. It allows us to gain a deeper understanding of a civilization that has had a profound influence on Western culture, and it invites us to reflect on our own attitudes towards sex, desire, and the human body. Now, wasn't that stimulating? Welcome back, history buffs. Tonight we're dimming the lights and drawing closer to the captivating world of ancient Greece, and more specifically, a very special event. It's time to explore the symposium and erotic entertainment, exploring the role of banquets, music, and dance in sexual expression. Now, when we think of ancient Greece, grand temples and philosophical debates might spring to mind. But life wasn't all serious business. Picture this, a gathering of men reclining on couches, surrounded by delicious food, flowing wine, and the enchanting melodies of music. This, my friends, was the symposium, a cornerstone of ancient Greek social life, and it was often, shall we say, a space where passions could ignite. The symposium, literally meaning drinking together, was much more than just a boozy get-together. It was an opportunity for male citizens, because let's remember the social constraints of the time, to engage in intellectual discourse, share poetry, and of course indulge in some good old-fashioned revelry. It was usually an exclusively male affair, although, as we will see, women often played a key role, albeit in a different capacity. The evening would typically begin with a formal dinner, followed by the symposium proper. A symposiarch, or master of ceremonies, would be chosen to oversee the proceedings, setting the tone for the night and ensuring that everyone drank in moderation. Well, usually. This host would determine the strength of the wine mixture. Water was always added, mind you, and the order in which toasts were made. But where does the erotic entertainment come in, you might ask? Well, as the wine flowed freely, inhibitions lowered, and the atmosphere became increasingly charged, music played a vital role in setting the mood. Flute players, lyre players, and singers were often hired to perform throughout the evening, their melodies weaving a tapestry of sound that enhanced the sensual experience. Think of it as the ancient Greek version of a carefully curated playlist for a very specific vibe. These musical performances often included erotic songs and dances, specifically designed to arouse the senses and stimulate desire. The lyrics might be suggestive, the melodies alluring, and the movements provocative. And this is where the hetairai often entered the picture. We've talked about hetairai before. These were highly educated and sophisticated courtesans who, unlike common prostitutes, were often valued for their wit, conversation, and artistic talents. They were skilled in music, dance, and rhetoric, making them ideal companions for the symposium. A hetera might perform a dance, recite poetry, or simply engage in witty banter with the guests, adding a layer of intrigue and excitement to the evening. Their dances were not just simple shuffles, mind you. They were carefully choreographed performances, often involving intricate movements and revealing costumes. Think of it as a very classy, very ancient striptease, but with intellectual conversation thrown in for good measure. Some hetairai became incredibly famous and influential, commanding high prices for their services and wielding considerable social power. They moved within the upper echelons of society and could be incredibly influential. Now, let's not forget about the pais, or boy, who would often serve the wine and attend to the guests. In some symposia, these young men were also the objects of erotic attention, a reflection of the pederastic relationships that were prevalent in ancient Greek society, which we discussed previously. The dynamic between the erastes, the older lover, and the eromenos, the younger beloved, could play out within the context of the symposium, with gifts exchanged and affections displayed. The symposium wasn't just about physical pleasure though, it was also about building social bonds and forging connections. The shared experience of drinking, eating, and enjoying entertainment created a sense of camaraderie among the participants. It was a place where men could relax, unwind, and express themselves freely, at least within the confines of their social class and gender roles. The symposium also served as a stage for displays of wealth and status. The quality of the wine, the opulence of the food, and the talent of the entertainers all reflected the host's standing in society. It was a way to impress guests, reinforce social hierarchies, and solidify one's position within the community. And let's be real, in that society, status was everything. Now, what exactly did these dances entail? Visual evidence is sparse, but we know they were not always solo acts. Sometimes dancers would perform in pairs or groups, creating intricate formations and telling stories through movement. Music could range from the simple sounds of a single flute to a full ensemble of stringed and wind instruments. And it wasn't just music and dance that fueled the erotic atmosphere. The Greeks also used aphrodisiacs. Specific herbs, spices, and even perfumes were believed to enhance sexual desire and performance. So as the wine flowed and the music played, subtle scents would fill the air, adding another layer of sensory stimulation. So to recap, the symposium was more than just a party. It was a complex social ritual that combined intellectual stimulation, artistic expression, and yes, erotic entertainment. It offers us a glimpse into the sensual side of ancient Greek life, reminding us that even in a society with strict social norms, there was always room for pleasure and desire. Of course, it's important to remember the inherent inequalities within this system. The symposium was largely the domain of elite men, while women's roles were often confined to the position of heterae, or servants. It's a reminder that when exploring history, we must always consider the perspectives of all involved, not just those in positions of power. But as we reflect on those long wine-filled nights, think about how it all came together. The music, the dancing, the whispered conversations. It truly was a party in the original, ancient sense of the word. So the next time you find yourself at a social gathering, raise a glass to the ancient Greeks, the masters of the symposium. Maybe even throw in a bit of erotic dancing to truly honor their legacy. But perhaps keep the water to wine ratio at something reasonable. Alright, settling in for a cozy look at ancient Greek family planning. It might not be the first thing that comes to mind when you picture classical Greece, but like every society, they had their ways of, well, dealing with the birds and the bees. So dim the lights, and let's gently explore the world of ancient Greek aphrodisiacs and contraception. First up, let's talk about setting the mood. You know, getting things going. Aphrodisiacs, right. Now, forget the modern-day connotations of some exotic scientifically backed potion. In ancient Greece, it was all about natural remedies and sometimes rather strange beliefs. Many substances were thought to possess aphrodisiac qualities. Herbs played a big role, of course. Think of the humble onion. Yes, the onion. Both raw and cooked, it was believed to stimulate desire. And garlic, its pungent cousin, also made the list. They believed these were both warming to the blood and stimulating. Not sure how romantic that sounds, but hey, who am I to judge ancient Greek dating rituals? Then there's rocket, also known as arugula. We sprinkle it on our salads today, but back then, it was considered a powerful love stimulant. Funny how things change, isn't it? Beyond the leafy greens, honey, with its sweetness and association with fertility, was also a popular choice. It wasn't just about the taste. Honey was linked to the goddess Aphrodite herself. It seemed like a natural fit. But it wasn't all just plants. Certain spices were also believed to fire up the passions. Saffron, for example, a very expensive spice even back then, was considered a potent aphrodisiac, probably because it made everything taste and look really, really fancy. Now, here's where things get a bit unique. Some believed that certain animal parts had aphrodisiac properties. Don't get too squeamish, but things like, well, certain organs were thought to enhance virility. I'll spare you the specifics, but let's just say the Greeks were resourceful when it came to acquiring these ingredients. And it wasn't all about physical substances. Charms and amulets also played a part. Love spells, carefully crafted incantations, and symbols associated with Aphrodite were all believed to help in matters of the heart and other regions. So after a romantic evening of onions, arugula, and maybe a whispered love spell, what happened next? Well, that's where contraception comes in. Now, before you imagine ancient Greek pharmacies filled with neatly packaged birth control pills, let me assure you, it wasn't quite that straightforward. The Greeks understood the link between sex and procreation, but their knowledge of the female reproductive system was, shall we say, a little hazy. Their understanding was based more on observation and folk remedies than on any kind of scientific understanding. One of the primary methods of contraception involved plants. Surprise, surprise. Silphium, a now extinct plant that grew primarily in Cyrenaica, modern-day Libya, was highly valued for its contraceptive properties. In fact, it was so valuable that it became a major source of wealth for the region. Unfortunately, its popularity led to its eventual extinction. Think of it as the ancient Greek version of, well, a really effective birth control pill. Its disappearance left a major hole in the contraceptive options available. Beyond silphium, other plants were used, often inserted vaginally. Various preparations of herbs like wild carrot seeds, rue and pennyroyal were used in an attempt to prevent pregnancy. These were likely not very effective, and in some cases could even have been dangerous. It's important to remember that these were often based on trial and error, and the error part could have had serious consequences. Then there were things called pessaries, which were essentially suppositories made from a variety of substances, including honey, cedar resin, and even crocodile dung. Yes, you heard that right. Crocodile dung. Charming, isn't it? The idea was that these substances would create a barrier to prevent sperm from reaching the egg. Again, their effectiveness is highly questionable, and the potential for irritation or infection was likely quite high. Other methods were less direct. Some Greek physicians recommended that women jump up and down after intercourse, or even squat and sneeze, in the hopes of dislodging any potential sperm. It might sound silly to us now, but desperate times, right? There's also evidence suggesting that some Greeks practiced coitus interruptus, or withdrawal. While not foolproof, it was likely one of the more reliable methods available to them. And finally, let's not forget about the role of magic and superstition. Amulets and charms were worn to ward off pregnancy. These might feature images of deities associated with childbirth or fertility, but in a negative way, essentially asking the gods to prevent conception. It's crucial to understand that these methods were not always reliable, and the concept of family planning was quite different from what we understand today. The Greeks didn't have access to the safe and effective contraceptive methods we have now. Their methods were often based on limited knowledge, superstition, and sometimes just plain desperation. So while ancient Greece might conjure images of philosophers, stunning architecture, and athletic prowess, it's important to remember that even in this cradle of civilization, people were grappling with very human concerns like, well, avoiding unwanted pregnancies. And they were doing it with a combination of surprisingly creative, albeit often ineffective, methods. It's a fascinating reminder that the human desire to control our own bodies and our own futures has been around for a very long time. Sleep tight, and maybe think twice before adding too many onions to your next salad. You never know. Okay, let's tiptoe into a more delicate area of ancient Greek relationships. Infidelity, or rather, how differently it was perceived depending on whether you were a man or a woman. This is where those ever-present double standards really raise their heads, casting long shadows across the landscape of marital expectations. Now, before we dive in, it's crucial to remember that our understanding comes from texts written primarily by men, for men, men, about a society structured to benefit men, so our picture is inherently skewed, colored by a patriarchal lens. But even with this caveat, the disparities are pretty stark. For women, particularly those of the citizen class, the Asti, fidelity was absolutely paramount. Marriage, remember, was primarily about legitimate heirs and the smooth transfer of property. A woman's primary duty was to produce children who could inherit and continue the family line. Any hint of infidelity jeopardized this entire system. If a woman engaged in an affair, it was considered a grave offense, a stain on her family's honor, and a violation of the social order. Think of it this way, a wife's womb wasn't just about carrying a child, it was about guaranteeing the legitimacy of that child and its claim to citizenship and inheritance. Her sexual purity ensured that the children she bore were undeniably her husband's, safeguarding the family's future. The consequences for female infidelity could be severe. While outright execution was rare, at least as far as we can tell from the surviving records, a husband had the right to divorce his wife and publicly denounce her adultery. This public shaming was devastating. A divorced woman lost her social standing and her dowry, essentially becoming a pariah. Her reputation would be ruined, making it incredibly difficult to remarry or even find support. Some accounts suggest husbands could also physically punish their wives. Though this was likely frowned upon by the law, it likely did occur. Now, let's flip the coin and look at the male perspective. For men, the situation was, well, considerably more relaxed. While adultery with another citizen's wife was technically against the law and could lead to legal repercussions, the definition of adultery was quite narrow. It primarily referred to sexual relations with a freeborn married woman. A man could, with relative impunity, engage in sexual relationships with slaves, prostitutes, both porni and heterai, and we will talk about them in detail later on, I promise, or even unmarried foreign women. These relationships weren't considered adulterous because these women didn't fall under the protection of citizen marriage laws. This wasn't necessarily considered socially acceptable, but it was certainly tolerated. There was a wink and nod acceptance of male sexual activity outside of marriage, as long as it didn't directly threaten the legitimacy of citizen heirs or the honor of another citizen family. Why this double standard? Well, it goes back to those core societal values we touched on earlier: property, lineage, and male dominance. Men controlled the household, the property, and the public sphere. Their sexual behavior was seen as less consequential to the core structure of society than a woman's. Their affairs didn't automatically threaten the family line in the same direct way that a woman's did. This doesn't mean that husbands openly advertised their extramarital affairs, of course. Discretion was still valued, partly to avoid public ridicule, and partly to maintain a semblance of marital harmony. Furthermore, Greek society had a complex understanding of male sexuality. It wasn't uncommon for men to engage in relationships with younger men, often within the context of paiderastia, a socially sanctioned relationship between an older man, the erastes, and a younger male, the eromenas. While this relationship had educational and social dimensions, it also often involved sexual activity. This dynamic further blurred the lines of what constituted acceptable male behavior within and outside of marriage. Let's also consider the societal pressure on men to prove their virility and strength. Having multiple sexual partners could be seen as a sign of masculine prowess, reinforcing their social standing and power. For women, however, the opposite was true. Their value lay in their chastity and their ability to produce legitimate heirs. It's important to note that not all men necessarily approved of this double standard. Some philosophers and playwrights, even within the patriarchal framework, voiced concerns about the injustice of holding women to a higher standard of sexual conduct than men. However, these voices were often in the minority, and the prevailing social norms largely favored male privilege in this area. So in essence, infidelity in ancient Greece was a deeply gendered affair. For women, it carried severe consequences, threatening their social standing, their economic security, and their family's honor. For men, while technically subject to legal restrictions in some cases, infidelity was often tolerated or even quietly condoned, reflecting the power imbalances inherent in Greek society. It was a system designed to protect male privilege and ensure the continuation of the family line through legitimate male heirs, even if it meant holding women to an entirely different set of rules. And that, my friends, is a double standard in its purest and most unfair form. A real reflection of the societal structures in place and the challenges faced by women in that era. Alright, settle in everyone. Tonight we're delving into something beautiful, quite literally. We're looking at how the ancient Greeks saw beauty, how they defined it, and how they showed it off in their art and stories. Think of it as Ancient Greek Aesthetics 101. Now, when we talk about beauty, especially in the ancient world, it's so important to remember that it's not just about physical attractiveness in the way we might think of it today. It was deeply intertwined with concepts of virtue, strength, and social status. And of course, it was very different for men and women. Let's start with the men. The ideal of male beauty in ancient Greece was well sculpted. Think perfectly proportioned muscles, a strong jawline, and an overall sense of athletic prowess. We see this everywhere in their art. Just picture those iconic statues of athletes, gods and heroes. Figures like the Doryphorus, or spear bearer, by Polycletus are perfect examples. They weren't just representing a man, they were embodying a whole set of ideals. These weren't just random guys they were sculpting. They were striving for perfection. Polycletus even developed what he called the canon, a set of mathematical ratios designed to create the perfectly balanced and harmonious human form. It wasn't just about looking good, it was about achieving a kind of divine order in the human body. So when you look at these statues, you're not just seeing impressive muscles, you're seeing an attempt to capture an ideal, a standard of excellence that went beyond the physical. And this ideal wasn't just about appearance, it was linked to virtue and citizenship. A beautiful man was expected to be a good man, a brave warrior, and a responsible citizen. Strength and beauty went hand in hand with moral character. Think of Achilles, the ultimate Greek hero. He was renowned for his beauty and his unmatched fighting skills. His physical prowess was seen as an outward manifestation of his inner strength and courage. Now, where can we see these ideals play out in the literature? Well, Homer's epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are full of descriptions of beautiful men. They're often described with epithets like godlike or radiant. These weren't just compliments, they were statements about their perceived worth and status. Beauty was a marker of excellence, a sign that someone was blessed by the gods and destined for greatness. But what about the ladies? Well, female beauty was a little different and a little more complex. While male beauty was all about strength and athleticism, female beauty was more focused on, shall we say, fertility and domesticity. Think of a full rounded figure, fair skin, and a generally delicate appearance. There's a famous statue of Aphrodite of Cnidos, which shows us that perfect female form. It's not muscular like the men, it's got curves and frankly a softness to it. And even the slight bit of pudginess that might be considered today as unhealthy was considered at the time a sign that the woman would birth healthy babies. It's not necessarily about being skinny and toned, it's about representing a woman who is capable of bearing children and nurturing a family. Of course, this ideal was also tied to social expectations. A beautiful woman was expected to be a good wife and mother, to manage the household, and to embody virtues like modesty and obedience. In literature, women are often described in terms of their beauty. Homer's Helen of Troy, famously the face that launched 1,000 ships, is a prime example. Her beauty was so extraordinary that it sparked a decade-long war. But it's interesting to note that Helen's beauty is also often associated with trouble and disruption. Her beauty is powerful, but it's also dangerous. It's a reminder that female beauty could be both admired and feared. It's worth pointing out that unlike the male ideal, which was often displayed publicly in athletic competitions and nude statues, female beauty was often more private and domestic. Women weren't typically depicted nude in public art. Their beauty was something to be admired within the context of marriage and family. However, there were exceptions. Heterae, the high-class courtesans, were often admired for their beauty, intelligence, and wit. They were educated and independent women who could participate in intellectual conversations and even influence political affairs. Their beauty wasn't just about physical appearance, it was about their overall charm and sophistication. Now, let's talk a little bit about how beauty was enhanced. Both men and women used cosmetics and perfumes. Women used things like white lead to lighten their skin, rouge to color their cheeks, and kohl to darken their eyes. They also used perfumes made from flowers and herbs to enhance their natural scent. Men, while perhaps not using makeup in the same way, were known to use oils and perfumes to keep their skin smooth and healthy. Hairstyles were also important. Women often wore their hair long and elaborately styled, with braids, curls, and ornaments. Men often wore their hair shorter, but they still took pride in its appearance. Cleanliness and grooming were highly valued for both sexes. It's so important to remember that these conceptions of beauty were deeply rooted in the social, cultural, and religious beliefs of ancient Greece. They weren't just about looking good, they were about embodying a whole set of values and ideals. And while some of these ideals might seem strange or even problematic to us today, they offer a fascinating glimpse into the world of ancient Greece and how they viewed the human form. So next time you see a Greek statue or read a Greek myth, take a moment to think about what these images are really saying about beauty, virtue, and the human condition. You might be surprised at what you discover. Now, close your eyes and imagine yourself there. What do you see? What do you feel? Sleep well, everyone. Alright, settle in, because now we're diving deep into the minds of some of ancient Greece's most influential thinkers, Plato and Aristotle. These guys weren't just scribbling in notebooks. Their ideas about love, desire, and even reproduction shaped societal norms and perceptions for centuries. So let's gently unpack their somewhat complex and, dare I say, sometimes contradictory viewpoints. Let's start with Plato, shall we? When you think of Plato, you probably think of his theory of forms, this idea that the physical world is just a shadow of a perfect, ideal realm. And wouldn't you know it, this concept permeates his understanding of love too. In his famous dialogue, Symposium, Plato explores different facets of love through a series of speeches given at, well, a symposium, basically a fancy drinking party with intellectual discussions. Now, one of the key ideas that emerges, particularly through the character of Socrates, who remember is often seen as Plato's mouthpiece, is the concept of platonic love. Now, before you start thinking about purely chaste, non-physical relationships, it's a little more nuanced than that. Platonic love, as described by Plato, begins with a physical attraction, usually towards a beautiful young man. But the ultimate goal isn't just physical gratification. No, it's about using that initial attraction as a stepping stone to something much higher, an appreciation for beauty itself. Through contemplating the beauty of an individual, you're meant to ascend to a contemplation of beauty in its ideal form. Think of it as climbing a ladder, from appreciating one beautiful person, to appreciating all beautiful people, to appreciating beautiful things, to appreciating beauty itself as an abstract concept. It's a journey towards intellectual and spiritual enlightenment, fueled by the initial spark of desire. And importantly, this platonic love was often associated with male-male relationships, specifically pederasty. Now, we've talked about that a little earlier, but just to reiterate, pederasty in ancient Greece wasn't just about sexual acts. It was a complex relationship between an older man, the Erastes, and a younger man, the Eromenos. The Erastes was meant to guide and mentor the Eromenos, helping him develop intellectually and morally. The physical aspect was often considered a component of this relationship, but the emphasis was supposed to be on education and personal growth. The idea was that the Erastes, inspired by the beauty and potential of the Eromenos, would strive to be a better person himself, and in turn guide the Eromenos towards virtue. Of course, the reality was likely far more complicated than this ideal. There were certainly power imbalances and abuses of this system. But the philosophical ideal, as presented by Plato, envisioned a relationship that transcended mere physical desire and aimed at something higher. It was about using love as a catalyst for self-improvement and the pursuit of knowledge. Okay, let's transition now to Aristotle, Plato's most famous student. While Aristotle shared some of Plato's concerns about virtue and the good life, his approach was much more grounded in the observable world. He was a scientist, an empiricist, and his views on love, desire, and reproduction reflect that. Unlike Plato's emphasis on abstract forms, Aristotle focused on the natural purpose of things. For Aristotle, everything has a telos, a final cause or purpose, and when it came to sex and reproduction, the purpose was pretty clear: procreation. He believed that the primary function of sexual activity was to produce offspring and ensure the continuation of the species. Now, this doesn't mean that Aristotle dismissed pleasure altogether. He acknowledged that pleasure was a natural part of the sexual act and could even strengthen the bond between a husband and wife. But he believed that pleasure should be subordinate to the primary purpose of reproduction. In other words, sex for pleasure alone wasn't necessarily seen as inherently wrong, but it wasn't the ideal either. Aristotle's views on gender also played a significant role in his understanding of reproduction. He believed that men and women had distinct roles in the process. Men provided the form or the blueprint for the offspring, while women provided the matter or the physical substance. Think of it like a sculptor creating a statue. The sculptor provides the idea and the design, while the marble provides the raw material. This idea, although obviously scientifically inaccurate by modern standards, had a profound impact on the way women were viewed in ancient Greek society. It reinforced the idea that women were passive and receptive, while men were active and creative. Furthermore, Aristotle's ideas about women extended beyond their role in reproduction. He believed that women were naturally less rational and more emotional than men, and therefore less capable of independent thought and decision-making. This, of course, justified the social restrictions placed upon women in ancient Greek society. They were largely confined to the domestic sphere, excluded from political life, and expected to be subservient to their husbands. Now, it's important to point out that both Plato and Aristotle's views on love, desire, and reproduction were shaped by their own cultural context. They lived in a society that valued male citizenship and intellectual pursuits above all else. Their philosophies, while influential, were also deeply embedded in the patriarchal norms of their time. So, what's the takeaway here? Well, Plato and Aristotle offer us a fascinating glimpse into the complexities of ancient Greek thought on these fundamental aspects of human life. Plato's emphasis on Platonic love highlights the potential for love to transcend mere physical desire and lead to intellectual and spiritual enlightenment. Aristotle, on the other hand, provides a more grounded, biologically based perspective, emphasizing the importance of procreation and the distinct roles of men and women. While their ideas may seem outdated or even problematic by modern standards, they were incredibly influential in shaping the social and sexual landscape of ancient Greece and beyond. And really, understanding their views helps us to better appreciate the nuances and complexities of ancient Greek sexuality as a whole. Sleep tight, and we'll delve into the social dynamics of public baths next time when we discuss ancient bathing rituals. Alright, settle in friends, let's gently wade into the world of ancient Greek public baths. More than just a place to scrub away the day's grime, these baths, or balania, were vibrant social hubs, teeming with life, conversation, and yes, even a touch of sexual intrigue. Imagine, if you will, stepping into a bustling space, the air thick with steam, the murmur of voices echoing off the tile. It was a far cry from our modern, often solitary, bathing experience. Now these weren't the sort of Romanesque, opulent bathhouses you might be picturing, all marble columns and heated floors. Those came later. The Greek version was simpler, more utilitarian perhaps. Think of them as a communal space, often privately owned but open to the public for a small fee. This fee, by the way, made bathing accessible to a wide range of citizens, though naturally, the wealthy could afford to frequent the nicer establishments. What made these places so socially significant? Well, for starters, they offered a rare opportunity for mingling across social strata. While rigid class divisions certainly existed in ancient Greece, the Balanion was a space where men from different backgrounds, merchants, artisans, philosophers, could rub shoulders, quite literally. It was a place for gossip, for business deals, for political discussions. Think of it as the ancient Greek equivalent of a coffee shop, but with considerably less clothing. And that, of course, brings us to the more intriguing aspect of these bathing rituals. Nudity was common, and while not necessarily explicitly sexualized in the way we might perceive it today, it undeniably created an atmosphere of heightened awareness and, potentially, attraction. The male body, particularly, was admired and celebrated in ancient Greek culture. Think of the perfectly sculpted physiques, immortalized in statues, and to be in a space where you were surrounded by these idealized forms, well, it certainly added a layer of interest to the bathing experience. But let's not jump to conclusions. It's important to remember that the primary purpose of the Balanion was hygiene and social interaction. While the potential for flirtation and even sexual encounters certainly existed, it wasn't necessarily the primary focus. However, the inherent intimacy of the setting undoubtedly played a role in shaping social and sexual dynamics. Consider the absence of strict gender segregation in some of these baths, at least in certain periods and regions. While dedicated women's baths existed, there were also instances of mixed-gender bathing, albeit often with separate times or designated areas. Can you imagine the social implications of that? The opportunities for subtle glances, overheard conversations, and perhaps even more direct interactions. Now, we need to be very careful here. We don't want to paint a picture of constant orgies and licentious behavior. That's simply not accurate. The ancient Greeks, like any society, their social norms and expectations. However, the relaxed atmosphere and the inherent vulnerability of being naked in a public space certainly created a unique environment for social and sexual expression. Think about it. Grooming practices were often performed in the Balanion. Men would shave, trim their beards, and oil their bodies, further enhancing their physical appearance and contributing to the overall aesthetic of the space. These acts, performed in the presence of others, were a form of social display, a way of signaling status, attractiveness, and even availability.
Furthermore, the Balanion often employed attendants, bathers, masseuses, and barbers who could play a role in facilitating these social interactions. A well-placed compliment, a lingering touch during a massage, these seemingly small gestures could carry significant weight in a setting where boundaries were already somewhat blurred. Of course, the Balanion was also a space for the exchange of information, both personal and public. Gossip and rumors would circulate freely, and one's reputation could be significantly impacted by the opinions formed in these communal spaces. Therefore, navigating the social dynamics of the Balanion required a certain degree of skill and awareness. Now, archaeological evidence suggests that some Balanion even offered additional services, shall we say. there are accounts of prostitutes operating in or near these establishments, offering a range of recreational activities. While not necessarily condoned by society at large, the presence of these sex workers underscores the complex and multifaceted nature of sexuality in ancient Greece. It highlights the blurring of lines between public and private, social and sexual, in these communal bathing spaces. So the next time you picture ancient Greece, don't just imagine philosophers in togas and grand temples. Picture the bustling Balanean, the air thick with steam and the murmur of voices, a place where social and sexual currents flowed freely, shaping the lives and relationships of the men and women who frequented them. It was a place of hygiene, yes, but also a place of community, of gossip, and perhaps of a little bit of naughtiness. Just a gentle reminder that history is rarely as simple as we think. Now, wouldn't a nice warm bath sound lovely? Alright, settle in, friend. Let's gently unravel the threads of something truly fascinating: how ancient Greek religious festivals and fertility rituals were interwoven with, well, you know, that. It's not always what you might expect. We tend to separate the sacred and the not so sacred, don't we? But for the ancient Greeks, the line was often blurred, hazy, almost non-existent at times. Their understanding of the world was deeply rooted in cycles, the cycles of the seasons, the cycles of life, death, and rebirth. And sexuality, that was seen as a fundamental part of that cycle, a powerful, vital force that deserved honoring. Yes, honoring. Think about it. Without procreation, there's no continuation of life, no crops growing in the fields, no future for the city-state. So it's not too surprising that acts we might consider private or even taboo today were sometimes brought into the public sphere, integrated into religious observances designed to ensure fertility and prosperity. One of the most prominent examples is the worship of Dionysus. Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, theatre, and, well, let's just say, uninhibited revelry. His festivals, the Dionysia, were legendary. They were chaotic, exuberant affairs filled with music, dancing, and yes, a fair amount of loose behavior. Phallic processions, where giant representations of the male anatomy were paraded through the streets, were a common sight. Now, these weren't just silly displays, they were symbolic gestures intended to invoke the god's blessing and ensure the fertility of the land and its people. The phallus, in this context, represented the generative power of nature, the life force itself. Think of it as a visual prayer for abundance. And the maenads, the female followers of Dionysus, they were often depicted as wild, frenzied women, tearing apart animals and engaging in ecstatic dances. While the actual extent of their behavior is debated, artistic license probably played a role. The core idea is that they tapped into a primal, untamed energy, a force linked to both fertility and the mysteries of life and death. Their rituals were about breaking free from societal constraints, losing oneself in the divine, and connecting with something larger than themselves. It was a controlled form of chaos, designed to stimulate the world around them into fruitful abundance. Then we have the Eleusinian Mysteries, one of the most secretive and revered religious rituals in ancient Greece. These rites, dedicated to Demeter, the goddess of agriculture, and her daughter Persephone, were shrouded in secrecy. Initiates underwent a series of rituals and experiences designed to bring them closer to the divine and offer hope for a better afterlife. While the exact details of the Eleusinian mysteries remain unknown, initiates were sworn to secrecy. You see, it's believed that they involved symbolic reenactments of Demeter's search for Persephone, who had been abducted by Hades, the god of the underworld. The focus was on themes of death, rebirth, and the cyclical nature of life. And yes, scholars suggest that fertility symbolism and perhaps even controlled sexual acts may have played a part in these rites. Again, the idea was to tap into that powerful life force, to ensure the continuation of the cycle. Consider also the Thesmophoria, a festival celebrated exclusively by women in honor of Demeter and Persephone. This 3-day event focused on fertility and the renewal of life. It involved rituals like fasting, feasting, and the symbolic planting of seeds. Intriguingly, evidence suggests that the Thesmophoria may have involved the use of a hem, anatomical votives, and other symbolic objects associated with fertility. Again, this was about invoking the goddess's blessings for a bountiful harvest and healthy births. It's also important to remember that ancient Greek religion wasn't a monolithic entity. Different regions and city-states had their own unique customs and beliefs. What was acceptable or even encouraged in one place might have been frowned upon in another, but the common thread running through many of these religious practices was the recognition of sexuality as a powerful force, intrinsically linked to the natural world and the well-being of the community. So the next time you think of ancient Greece, don't just picture philosophers in togas. Picture phallic processions, frenzied manads, and secret rituals held under the cover of darkness. Picture a society that wasn't afraid to confront the raw primal aspects of human existence and weave them into the fabric of their religious beliefs. It might seem strange to us now, but for the ancient Greeks, it was all part of the great cycle of life. It was about ensuring that the world continued to turn, that the crops continued to grow, and that future generations would thrive. And isn't that in the end what we all want? Sweet dreams now. Alright, settle in friends, because we're diving into the nitty-gritty of ancient Greek law, specifically as it pertained to the bedroom and everything connected to it. Now, when we think of ancient Greece, we might picture philosophers, stunning architecture, and let's be honest, maybe a few toga parties. But beneath all that, there was a surprisingly complex legal framework governing marriage, adultery, and even prostitution. Let's gently peel back the layers, shall we? First, let's talk marriage. Now, marriage in ancient Greece, particularly in Athens, wasn't exactly the romantic ideal we often envision today. It was primarily about procreation. Sounds clinical, I know, but bear with me. The primary purpose of marriage was to produce legitimate male heirs who could inherit property and continue the family line. Love. Well, that was nice if it happened, but it wasn't the driving force behind tying the knot. Think of it more as a contract, a social and civic duty. Legally, marriage involved a transfer of guardianship of the woman from her father, or male, relative to her husband. The bride would bring a dowry, which remained her property within the marriage, providing some financial security and leverage should the marriage dissolve. This dowry wasn't just a nice to have, it was crucial. If a divorce occurred, the dowry typically had to be returned to the wife's family. Now, the laws surrounding divorce were interesting. A husband could divorce his wife rather easily, essentially by sending her away. The reasons could be varied, from infertility to, frankly, just not liking her anymore. Women, on the other hand, had a much harder time initiating divorce. They generally needed to prove serious mistreatment, neglect, or abuse to the Athenian courts. It was an uphill battle, to say the least. Imagine trying to navigate that legal system. Just the thought makes me sleepy. Adultery then. Yes, this is where things get murkier. For men, adultery was generally defined as having sex with another man's wife, daughter, sister, or mother within that household. So the crime wasn't so much about infidelity in general, but about violating the property rights and honor of another citizen. If a husband caught his wife in the act of adultery, he had the legal right to kill her lover on the spot. It was a drastic measure, to say the least, and one that could easily lead to further violence and family feuds. The wronged husband could also choose to bring legal charges against the adulterer, which could result in fines, public humiliation, or even exile. Now, what about the wife who committed adultery? Well, her punishment was severe. Divorce was guaranteed, and she was often barred from participating in religious ceremonies or public life. Her reputation would be utterly ruined, and she would become a social outcast. It was a harsh double standard, to say the least, reflecting the patriarchal nature of ancient Greek society. Men could often get away with extramarital affairs, especially with slaves or heterai, those educated courtesans we've discussed. For women, though, the consequences were devastating. Sleep tight knowing that system is not how it works today. Let's shift our focus to prostitution. It was a widespread and accepted part of ancient Greek life. It existed in various forms, from high-class heterai, who offered intellectual companionship along with sexual services, to lower-class pornai, who worked in brothels or on the streets. The legal status of prostitutes varied. Heterai, because of their education and often independent status, were usually subject to fewer legal restrictions. They could own property, enter into contracts, and even participate in some aspects of public life, though not to the same extent as male citizens, of course. Pornai, on the other hand, were often subject to stricter regulations. Brothels were usually taxed and regulated by the state, at least in Athens. While prostitution itself wasn't illegal, certain aspects of it were controlled. For instance, Athenian law forbade prostitutes from wearing clothing that was typically reserved for citizen women. This was a way to visually distinguish them and prevent them from being mistaken for respectable wives or daughters. It's all about making sure everyone knows their place, in the eyes of the law, at least. Interestingly, there were laws designed to protect prostitutes from violence and exploitation, at least in theory. A brothel owner, for example, could be held liable for mistreating or abusing the women in their employ. But let's be realistic, enforcement of these laws was probably inconsistent, at best. It was a world rife with power imbalances, and the legal system, while attempting to regulate it, likely didn't always offer adequate protection to the most vulnerable. Now one might wonder, how did these laws and regulations actually function in everyday life? Well, the answer is, it depended. Social status, wealth, and political connections all played a role in how the law was applied. A wealthy and influential man could often get away with things that a poorer citizen couldn't, and as we've already touched on, women generally had far less power and recourse to legal protection than men. The legal landscape of ancient Greek sexuality was complex and often contradictory. It reflected the social norms, values, and power dynamics of the time. While there were laws in place to regulate marriage, adultery, and prostitution, their application was often uneven and biased. It's a reminder that legal systems, even in ancient times, weren't always fair or just. And with that, I think we've thoroughly explored the legal aspects of love, marriage, and, well, other things in ancient Greek. Time for a nap, don't you think?
Alright, let's settle in and talk about Athens, the dazzling heart of ancient Greece, and take a sleepy stroll through its peculiar perspective on sex. Now, when we picture ancient Greece, often it's Athens that pops into our heads. The Parthenon, philosophy, democracy, and, well, some pretty interesting ideas about sex and love. So let's get one thing straight right away. The Athenian view was complicated. It wasn't a monolithic, everyone agreed on everything sort of situation. Different people had different ideas, but we can paint a picture of the general vibe, the most common social norms, the things that would have been considered fairly standard, or at least not too shocking. First, let's talk about citizenship. Citizenship was king, queen, and the whole court. Everything revolved around it. Athenian citizens were, generally speaking, free adult males, born of Athenian parents, and the preservation of that citizenship, the continuation of the family line, was paramount. This, in large part, drove the prevailing views on marriage. Marriage in Athens was primarily about procreation, not necessarily about romantic love or even companionship.
although those things could certainly be present. The main goal was to produce legitimate heirs, citizens who would carry on the family name, inherit property, and participate in Athenian society. The wife, the Ginne, was expected to be loyal, dutiful, and above all, fertile. Women, even citizen women, occupied a very different space than men. Their lives were largely confined to the domestic sphere. They managed the household, oversaw the slaves, and most importantly, raised the children. Their public presence was limited. They didn't participate in politics. They rarely attended public events. Their reputation was everything. A woman's honor, her sophrosyne, was tied directly to her sexual purity and fidelity. Now this might all sound a little, well, restrictive, and it was, but it's important to remember the context. Athenian society was deeply concerned with maintaining order, preserving traditions, and ensuring the continuation of the polis, the city-state, and the roles assigned to men and women were seen as essential to that stability. But, and this is a big but, the story doesn't end there, because within this seemingly rigid structure, there was room for complexity, especially when it came to male relationships. Male-male relationships, specifically pederasty. A relationship between an older man, the erastes, and a younger male adolescent, the eromenos, were a recognized and in certain circles, even celebrated part of Athenian life. This wasn't just about physical attraction, it was considered a form of education, mentorship, and social advancement. The erastes would guide and teach the eromenos, helping him develop into a virtuous citizen. The eromenos, in turn, would offer his beauty and admiration. The ideal was that the relationship would be chaste, or at least restrained, until the eromenos reached adulthood. But of course, the reality was often more nuanced, and the social acceptability of these relationships varied. They were more common and accepted among the elite classes, the wealthy and influential Athenians. They were also heavily romanticized in literature and art. It's vital to remember, however, that pederasty was not a universal practice. Many Athenians frowned upon it, seeing it as unnatural or even harmful, and it certainly wasn't a free-for-all. There were rules, expectations, and potential consequences for violating them. For example, taking advantage of a freeborn boy without his consent was considered a serious offense. But what about women? Well, that's where it gets even more layered. Female-female relationships were less openly discussed or represented in Athenian society. Our understanding of them is largely based on fragmented evidence and interpretations. We know that there were strong bonds of friendship and affection between women. We also know that there were accusations and rumors of lesbian relationships, though the details are often hazy. The relative silence on female-female relationships doesn't necessarily mean they didn't exist. It may simply reflect the limited access women had to public life, and the bias of the historical record, which was primarily written by men. Then there were the heterae. These were courtesans, often highly educated and independent women, who provided companionship and intellectual stimulation to wealthy men. They were different from prostitutes, pornai, who primarily offered sexual services. Heterae were often skilled in music, dance, and conversation. They could participate in symposia, intellectual gatherings, and even offer advice to their patrons. They were in a way exceptions to the general rules that governed women's lives, carving out a space for themselves in Athenian society. Now I know this might all seem a bit all over the place. The strict rules for citizen women, the accepted pederasty, the enigmatic heterae. It's a complex picture, but that's the point. Athenian sexuality wasn't simple. It was shaped by social pressures, political concerns, religious beliefs, and personal desires. It was a tapestry woven with threads of tradition, innovation, and contradiction, and understanding it requires us to move beyond simplistic stereotypes and embrace the nuances of this fascinating ancient culture. So just drift off while thinking about that fascinating tapestry. Good night, gentle calming music begins to fade in. Welcome back, history seekers. Tonight, we're venturing away from the bustling marketplaces and philosophical debates of Athens and journeying to a place that marched to the beat of its own very distinct drum, Sparta. And of course, we're talking about what sex was really like. Spartan society was, well, it was different, a lot different. Where Athens celebrated art, philosophy, and individual expression, Sparta prized military prowess, discipline, and the unwavering dedication to the state, even in the bedroom. It might be a little jarring for our modern sensibilities, but understanding their unique approach to sexuality is key to understanding the Spartan identity. So forget the romanticized image of noble warriors that Hollywood often throws at us. We're diving deep into the realities, and sometimes the oddities, of Spartan sexual customs. The foundation of Spartan sexuality was, without a doubt, procreation. Simply put, the purpose of sex in Sparta was to create strong, healthy offspring for the state. They needed soldiers. They needed mothers of soldiers. Everything revolved around that. Personal pleasure. Well, that was definitely secondary. Now let's talk about marriage. Spartan marriage wasn't quite the grand celebratory affair we might imagine. Instead, young Spartan women would undergo rigorous physical training, just like the men. They weren't confined to domestic duties. They were expected to be strong, athletic, and capable of bearing healthy children. The marriage ceremony itself was, well, let's just say it was unusual. According to some accounts, the bride would have her head shaved, be dressed in men's clothing, and then left alone in a darkened room. The groom would then sneak in and consummate the marriage in secret. This practice, some historians believe, was designed to promote modesty and encourage couples to focus on the practicalities of procreation rather than romantic notions. Other theories suggest it was to ease the transition into marriage and encourage a sense of playfulness. Whatever the reason, it was certainly different, but the unusual customs don't end there. In Sparta there was this, well, it was a system of what we might call wife sharing, but with some very specific rules and reasons behind it. If a man was unable to produce children, or if the state believed that a particular woman was especially suited to bear strong offspring, he might be encouraged to lend his wife to another man. This wasn't seen as adultery, but rather as a patriotic duty. The goal was to ensure the continuation of strong Spartan bloodlines. Now I know what you might be thinking, that sounds incredibly awkward and impersonal. And well, yes, it probably was, but remember, the individual was less important than the state in Sparta. The needs of the community always came first. There's evidence to suggest that the Spartan state also encouraged men to produce as many children as possible, regardless of whether they were married or not. This was done with the intention of expanding their population and ensuring a steady supply of warriors. Beyond procreation, there are some hints about same-sex relationships in Sparta, particularly among the warrior class. Now don't expect anything explicit, but the close bonds forged in the military, the shared experiences, and the intense camaraderie likely led to some form of intimate relationships. Some historians argue that these relationships were encouraged, as they believed it strengthened bonds between soldiers and made them more effective in battle. The sacred band of Thebes is a more well-known example of this phenomenon, but some scholars believe similar dynamics existed within Spartan society. However, it's important to remember that these relationships were likely very different from what we understand as homosexual relationships today. The primary focus was still on military effectiveness and loyalty to the state. It's less about identity and more about a specific type of bond built through shared experience and potentially physical intimacy. Now, what about female sexuality in Sparta? That's a tougher question to answer. Historical records are overwhelmingly focused on the male experience, particularly the military. However, we do know that Spartan women were given a level of freedom and education that was virtually unheard of in other Greek city-states. They participated in athletic training, managed property, and were generally considered to be more assertive and independent than their Athenian counterparts. This relative freedom likely influenced their sexual experiences as well. While their primary role was to bear children, it's unlikely that they were entirely passive in their relationships. They had agency, and they were expected to be strong and capable. The Spartans, as you can gather, had a very pragmatic and state-centered view of sex. Their customs, while strange to us, were rooted in their desire to create a strong, disciplined and enduring society. It wasn't about pleasure, romance or individual expression. It was about duty, procreation, and the survival of the Spartan state.
While we might not agree with their methods, it's important to understand them within their historical context. Sparta was a unique and fascinating society, and their approach to sexuality reflects their broader values and priorities. And, let's be honest, it's a stark reminder of how different cultures can view the same fundamental human drives. And with that, my friends, we've explored the rather distinct sexual landscape of ancient Sparta. I hope you found that as fascinating as I did. Until next time, sleep well and keep exploring. Good night. Alright, settle in friends, because we're about to embark on a journey that takes us beyond the familiar city-states of Greece and into the vast, sprawling empire forged by a young, ambitious king. That's right, we're talking about Alexander the Great and the rise of Macedon. Now you might be wondering, what does a military conquest have to do with, well, this topic? And that's a perfectly fair question. The answer, as always, is quite a lot. Think of it like this: when you shake up a snow globe, everything inside shifts and settles in new and unexpected ways. Alexander's conquests were like a massive snow globe shake-up for the ancient world. Greek culture, including its attitudes towards sex and relationships, spread far and wide, but it also encountered and was influenced by the customs of the lands it conquered. It wasn't a simple case of Greek norms being imposed on everyone else. Instead, it was a complex dance of cultural exchange, adaptation, and sometimes outright conflict. And that, my friends, makes for a fascinating story. Before Alexander, the Greek world was largely defined by independent city-states like Athens and Sparta, each with its own distinct social and sexual mores. While we've explored the nuances of those earlier practices, it's important to remember that they weren't uniform across the entire Greek peninsula. With the rise of Macedon, a new power dynamic emerged, and with it, a shift in the social landscape. One of the key changes was the increasing cosmopolitanism of Greek society. Alexander's empire stretched from Greece to Egypt, Persia, and even parts of India. This meant that Greeks were now interacting with people from vastly different cultures, each with its own ideas about gender roles, sexuality, and family structures. Soldiers, merchants, administrators, all were encountering new and sometimes shocking customs. This exposure inevitably led to a blurring of cultural boundaries and a re-evaluation of traditional Greek norms. Now, it's tempting to think that this cultural mixing would have led to a more tolerant and liberal society, at least in regards to sexuality, and in some ways it may have. But the reality is far more complex. On one hand, the spread of Greek culture did lead to the dissemination of certain Greek practices, such as the symposium, which, as we've discussed, provided a space for socializing, intellectual discussion, and yes, sometimes erotic encounters. Greek art, with its often uninhibited depictions of the human form, also influenced artistic styles in other regions. However, the conquest also brought with it a degree of cultural anxiety. Some Greeks worried that their traditional values were being eroded by foreign influences. There was a sense that the purity of Greek culture needed to be defended against the perceived decadence of the East. This anxiety manifested in various ways, including a renewed emphasis on traditional gender roles and a stricter enforcement of social norms. For example, while the hetairai, the educated and independent courtesans, continued to exist in the Hellenistic period,
period, they may have faced increasing social pressure to conform to more conventional expectations of female behavior. Similarly, while male-male relationships remained a part of Greek society, they may have been viewed with greater suspicion in some quarters, particularly among those who saw them as a sign of moral decay. Another important factor to consider is the changing political landscape. Under Alexander and his successors, the independent city-states of Greece lost much of their autonomy. Power became centralized in the hands of kings and emperors, who often had their own agendas and priorities. These rulers could, and did, influence social and sexual norms through their patronage, their laws, and their personal example. For instance, some of the Hellenistic rulers adopted elaborate court rituals and practices that were influenced by Persian and Egyptian traditions. These rituals often involved displays of wealth, power, and yes, sometimes, sexual license. While these practices may have been shocking to some Greeks, they became increasingly common in the Hellenistic world. It's also worth noting that the rise of Macedon coincided with a period of significant social and economic change. The expansion of trade and commerce led to the growth of cities and the emergence of a new merchant class. This new wealth brought with it new opportunities and new challenges, including a greater emphasis on material possessions and a more individualistic lifestyle. These changes inevitably affected attitudes towards sex and relationships, as people began to prioritize personal pleasure and fulfillment over traditional social expectations. So, where does all of this leave us? Well, it leaves us with a picture of a society in flux, a society grappling with the challenges and opportunities of a rapidly changing world. The rise of Macedon didn't lead to a uniform shift in sexual customs across the Greek world. Instead, it created a mosaic of different practices and attitudes, influenced by local traditions, political realities, and individual choices. Understanding how social and sexual customs shifted during this period requires a nuanced and critical approach. We can't simply assume that the spread of Greek culture led to a more liberal or tolerant society. We need to examine the specific ways in which Greek practices were adapted and reinterpreted in different contexts. We need to consider the role of political power, economic change, and cultural anxiety in shaping attitudes towards sex and relationships. And perhaps most importantly, we need to remember that the ancient world was just as complex and diverse as our own. It's a world of shifting sands where the familiar landmarks of the city-states begin to blur and reshape themselves into something new and perhaps a little bit strange. But within that strangeness, we can glimpse the seeds of our own world, the world of cultural exchange, global commerce, and the ongoing struggle to define what it means to be human. And as we drift off tonight, perhaps we can ponder this. Were they so different from us, those ancient souls struggling with desire, love, and connection in a world that never stops changing? Alright, settle in friends, because we're about to wade into a slightly less glamorous, though absolutely crucial, aspect of ancient Greek life, diseases and health concerns, specifically as they relate to, shall we say, intimate activities. Now before you conjure up images of gleaming marble statues and athletic gods, remember that ancient life, regardless of its artistic achievements, was still riddled with health challenges that we, with our modern medicine, can often take for granted. The ancient Greeks, bless their hearts, didn't exactly have a comprehensive understanding of sexually transmitted infections or STIs as we know them today. Their knowledge of medicine, while advanced in some ways, was largely based on observation, herbal remedies, and let's be honest, a fair bit of guesswork. The concept of bacteria or viruses, these microscopic villains causing so much trouble, was of course completely unknown. They simply lacked the tools and the scientific framework to truly grasp the nature of these illnesses. Instead, they often attributed ailments to imbalances in the body's humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. An excess or deficiency in any of these was thought to cause illness. So if someone presented with symptoms of what what we might now recognize as, say, gonorrhea, they might be diagnosed as having an imbalance of, well, probably too much phlegm, if we're being honest. The proposed cure, likely bloodletting, dietary adjustments, or some concoction of herbs intended to restore harmony to the humors. And as you can imagine, these treatments were less than effective when it came to tackling the actual root cause of the infection. But that doesn't mean they were completely oblivious. Ancient physicians such as Hippocrates and his followers were keen observers of symptoms. They documented various ailments and attempted to find patterns. They certainly noticed, for example, that certain conditions seemed to be linked to sexual activity. Though they couldn't pinpoint the exact mechanism of transmission, they understood, on some level, that sex could lead to illness. They just didn't know how or why in the way that we do. Now, the terms they used to describe these conditions were vague, to say the least. They didn't have specific labels for gonorrhea, syphilis, or chlamydia. Instead, they might use general terms like ulcers or fluxes to describe symptoms in the genital region. Descriptions of skin lesions, discharges, and pain were sometimes recorded, but without the context of modern medical science, it's often difficult for us to know precisely which illness they were dealing with. One condition that scholars believe they may have recognized in a rudimentary way was something akin to gonorrhea. Descriptions of painful urination and discharge are found in some medical texts, hinting at this possibility. Syphilis, on the other hand, is thought to have been a later arrival in Europe, likely brought over from the Americas after Columbus's voyages, so it's unlikely to have been a significant concern in ancient Greece. What about treatment? Well, as I mentioned earlier, herbal remedies were a mainstay. Various plants were believed to have healing properties, and concoctions made from them were often prescribed. Unfortunately, these remedies were rarely effective against STIs. Some might have offered temporary relief from symptoms, but they didn't address the underlying infection. Things like warm baths, ointments, and poultices were likely used to soothe discomfort, but they were more palliative than curative. Public health measures, as we understand them, were also largely absent. There were no widespread campaigns to promote safe sex practices or to encourage testing and treatment. The concept of quarantining individuals with infectious diseases was understood to some degree, especially during epidemics of diseases like the plague, but this was less often applied to sexually transmitted conditions, perhaps because of the social stigma attached to them. And that leads us to another crucial point: social attitudes. Sex, as we've discussed in earlier episodes, was a complex and often nuanced aspect of ancient Greek society. However, illness, particularly illness linked to sexual activity, could carry a significant social stigma. This might have led some individuals to avoid seeking medical help, further hindering any attempts to understand and control the spread of these diseases. Think about it. If you're ashamed of the way that you obtained an illness, or how you might be perceived, you are much less likely to seek treatment and potentially spread the infection even further. Furthermore, the lack of effective treatments and the limited understanding of transmission meant that STIs could have had a significant impact on fertility and reproductive health. Untreated infections can lead to complications such as pelvic inflammatory disease (PID) in women, which can cause infertility. The Greeks were certainly aware of the importance of procreation, so these health concerns would have been a serious issue, even if they didn't fully grasp the underlying causes. In essence, life in ancient Greece included a constant struggle against a whole host of illnesses, many of which we now have simple ways to prevent and treat. The lack of knowledge of sexually transmitted infections led to ineffective treatments and a social stigma that likely exacerbated the problem. While we can admire the artistic and philosophical achievements of this ancient civilization, it's important to remember that their daily lives were often filled with health challenges that we can scarcely imagine today. It's a humbling reminder of how far we've come, and a testament to the importance of modern medicine. Now, isn't that something to think about as we drift off to sleep? Welcome back, history enthusiasts. Tonight, let's dim the lights just a little lower and settle in for a glimpse into the lighter, perhaps even naughtier, side of ancient Greek life. We're turning our attention to the theatre. a cornerstone of Greek culture, and specifically the wonderfully cheeky world of satire and its use of sexual humor. Now, when we think of ancient Greek drama, we might immediately picture grand tragedies filled with epic heroes and heartbreaking fates. And while those were certainly a significant part of the theatrical landscape, there was another far more ribald side to the story. A side that wasn't afraid to poke fun at everything, from the gods themselves to the most respected figures in society. Think of it as ancient Greece's version of late-night comedy, but with even fewer restrictions and far more togas. Greek comedies, especially those from the Old Comedy period, which spanned roughly the 5th century BC, were known for their outrageous plots, over-the-top characters, and, you guessed it, plenty of bawdy humor. These weren't polite comedies of manners, mind you. They were raucous, uninhibited, and often downright shocking, at least by our modern sensibilities. A master of this comedic form was Aristophanes. His plays, such as Lysistrata, The Clouds, and The Frogs, are filled with puns, slapstick, and, well, let's just say a healthy dose of sexual innuendo. Lysistrata, for instance, famously depicts a group of Athenian women, led by the titular Lysistrata, who decide to withhold sex from their husbands as a means of forcing an end to the Peloponnesian War. Imagine that for a moment, a play advocating for peace through a sex strike. It's both incredibly funny and surprisingly insightful, isn't it? The humor, of course, lies in the absurdity of the situation, the frustration of the men, and the women's clever manipulation of their societal roles. It's a powerful commentary wrapped in layers of laughter. But it wasn't just about shock value. The sexual humor in these plays often served a deeper purpose. It was a way to challenge authority, to question social norms, and to explore the complexities of human desire. By making fun of these things, Aristophanes and other playwrights could encourage their audience to think critically about the world around them. Now you might be wondering, how exactly did they get away with this? Well, the Dionysia, the festival in which these plays were performed, was a time of revelry and celebration. It was a chance for people to let loose, to express themselves, and to temporarily suspend the usual rules of society. Think of it as a pressure valve, a designated space for comedic catharsis. The festival was dedicated to Dionysus, the god of wine, fertility, and theatre, so a certain amount of, shall we say, exuberance was expected. In fact, the very origins of comedy are believed to be linked to phallic processions and fertility rituals dedicated to Dionysus. So sexual humor wasn't just tolerated, it was almost encouraged. Furthermore, the plays often employed masks and costumes that exaggerated physical features, including, yes, male genitalia. These weren't meant to be realistic representations, of course. They were caricatures designed to provoke laughter and to emphasize the play's satirical intent. Beyond Aristophanes, other playwrights also contributed to this tradition of sexual humor in Greek drama. Menander, for example, who wrote during the New Comedy period, which followed the Old Comedy, offered a more domestic and subtle form of humor, often revolving around romantic entanglements and mistaken identities. While his plays were less overtly political than Aristophanes, they still explored themes of love, desire, and the complexities of human relationships, often with a wink and a nudge. These plays also offer us a fascinating window into the everyday lives and attitudes of ancient Greeks. They reveal their concerns about marriage, relationships, social status, and of course sex. By examining the humor in these plays, we can gain a deeper understanding of what the ancient Greeks found funny, what they considered taboo, and what they valued as a society. But it's important to remember that what was considered funny or acceptable in ancient Greece might be quite different from what we consider funny or acceptable today. For example, jokes that relied on stereotypes or derogatory remarks about certain groups were not uncommon. While we might find these jokes offensive today, they offer valuable insights into the prejudices and biases that existed in ancient Greek society. So as we drift off to sleep tonight, let's reflect on the surprisingly spicy world of ancient Greek theatre. It was a world where laughter was used as a weapon, a tool for social commentary, and a celebration of life in all its messy and often hilarious glory. And with that, sweet dreams, and may your own dreams be filled with as much humor and insight as the plays of Aristophanes. Good night. Alright friends, let's gently transition to a fascinating part of our journey, how ancient Greek sexuality compares, or perhaps contrasts, with modern perspectives. Now this is where things get, well, interesting, because what was considered normal, even celebrated, back then might raise a few eyebrows, or even spark outright disapproval today. So settle in, let's explore these differences, shall we? One of the most significant, and arguably most controversial distinctions lies in the realm of male-male relationships, particularly the practice of pederasty. As we discussed earlier, this wasn't simply about sexual gratification. It was deeply intertwined with education, mentorship, and the transmission of social values. An older established man, the Erastes, would guide and mentor a younger man, the Eromenos, fostering his intellectual and moral development. The sexual aspect, while present, was often seen as secondary to this broader relationship. Now in our modern world, relationships between adults and minors are, rightfully so, almost universally condemned. We have strict laws and cultural norms designed to protect children and prevent exploitation. The idea of an adult male having a sexual relationship with an adolescent, even within a seemingly structured framework, is abhorrent to most modern sensibilities. It's crucial to remember that the ancient Greek concept of consent differed drastically from our own. The Eromenos, while perhaps having some agency, was still in a position of relative powerlessness compared to the Erastes. So while we can analyze the historical context, we absolutely must view it through the lens of modern ethical considerations. This is not to condone but to understand. It is important to recognize the power dynamics that existed, and how those power dynamics are now considered completely unacceptable. Furthermore, the ancient Greeks didn't necessarily categorize sexual orientation in the same way we do today. A man might engage in relationships with both men and women without it necessarily defining his identity. The idea of being exclusively gay or straight wasn't as firmly established. Our modern understanding of sexual orientation, often rooted in the concept of inherent attraction and identity, is a relatively recent development. Today we place a high value on self-identification and the freedom to express one's sexuality authentically. In ancient Greece, the emphasis was more on social roles and responsibilities. A man was expected to marry and produce children, regardless of his other sexual proclivities. Another stark difference lies in the treatment of women. While we've seen glimpses of female agency, particularly among the heterae, the overall status of women in ancient Greece was undeniably restrictive. They were largely confined to the domestic sphere, with limited access to education, political participation, or economic independence. Their primary role was seen as bearing legitimate heirs and managing the household. This contrasts sharply with modern societies, where women have achieved significant advancements in education, employment, and political representation, at least in many parts of the world. While gender inequality still persists, the fundamental principle of equal rights and opportunities for women is widely accepted, at least in theory. Then there's the matter of public displays of nudity. In ancient Greece, nudity, particularly male nudity, was commonplace in athletic competitions, religious rituals, and even artistic representations. It wasn't necessarily viewed as inherently sexual or provocative. The focus was often on the beauty and perfection of the human form, a celebration of the physical ideal. Today, while attitudes towards nudity vary across cultures, it's generally considered more private and regulated. Public nudity, outside of specific contexts like beaches or artistic performances, is often restricted by law. We tend to associate nudity more strongly with sexuality and privacy than the ancient Greeks did. Now think about our modern concept of romantic love. We often idealize the notion of finding a soulmate, a partner with whom we share a deep emotional and physical connection. This idea, while not entirely absent in ancient Greece, wasn't necessarily the primary focus in many relationships, particularly within marriage. Marriage was often seen as a practical arrangement aimed at securing lineage and property. Romantic love, while it could exist, was often considered separate from the institution of marriage, perhaps even a dangerous distraction. Now don't get me wrong, feelings were definitely involved, but our 21st century expectations for marriage are heavily influenced by notions of companionship, emotional intimacy, and shared life goals that were, well, perhaps less emphasized in ancient Greece. Let's also consider the context of sexual violence and exploitation. While we can glean some insights from historical texts and archaeological evidence, it's difficult to fully grasp the extent of these issues in ancient Greece. However, we can assume that sexual violence, particularly against women and slaves, was likely present, even if it wasn't always explicitly documented. Today we have laws and social movements dedicated to combating sexual violence and supporting survivors. We have a greater awareness of issues like consent, power dynamics, and the long-term impact of trauma. While we still have a long way to go in eradicating sexual violence, the fact that we openly discuss and address these issues represents a significant departure from the past. Finally, we need to acknowledge the influence of Christianity on Western attitudes towards sexuality. The rise of Christianity brought with it a stricter moral code, emphasizing monogamy, procreation within marriage, and the suppression of deviant sexual behaviors. This Christian influence has shaped our cultural norms and legal systems for centuries, leading to a more conservative and restrictive view of sexuality compared to the relatively more open and diverse landscape of ancient Greece. So in essence, comparing ancient Greek sexuality with modern perspectives is like comparing apples and oranges, maybe even apples and spaceships. The social, cultural, and religious contexts are so vastly different that direct comparisons can be misleading. It's crucial to approach this topic with sensitivity, historical awareness, and a critical eye, recognizing that our modern values and ethical considerations are not necessarily universal or timeless. What's most important to remember is to respect the past, understand the present, and learn from both as we continue to navigate our own complex understanding of human sexuality. Now, doesn't that sound like a nice, peaceful thought to drift off to? And so we reach the end of our journey, a journey through the sun-drenched landscapes and the shadowed corners of ancient Greek sexuality. It's been a winding road, hasn't it? Filled with gods and goddesses, symposiums and Sappho, battles and well beds. It's easy to fall into the trap of simplifying history, to paint it with broad strokes of good or bad, right or wrong. But the truth, as always, is far more textured, far more human. And ancient Greek sexuality, like all aspects of their culture, was nothing if not intensely, fascinatingly human. If there's one key takeaway I hope you're carrying with you, it's this: there was no single monolithic ancient Greek sexuality. It wasn't one thing. We've explored so many facets, from the codified pederastic relationships, the mentor-student bond that intertwined intellectual growth with physical affection, to the constraints placed upon women within the domestic sphere, their lives largely dictated by the demands of marriage and motherhood. We touched upon the vibrant independent world of the heterae, the courtesans whose intellectual prowess and social savvy often rivaled that of men, and considered the stark realities of the pornae, the everyday prostitutes whose experiences painted a very different, often harsher, picture of sexual commerce.
We've seen how sexuality was woven into the fabric of their religious beliefs, expressed in fertility rituals, and immortalized in art and literature. Think of the explicit depictions on pottery, the idealized forms of sculpture, the often bawdy humor of their plays. These weren't simply isolated instances, they were integral parts of how the ancient Greeks understood and expressed their humanity.
And remember the differences between the city-states. Athens, with its emphasis on intellectual pursuits and democratic ideals, had its own particular flavor of sexuality, while Sparta, prioritizing military strength and communal living, fostered a very different set of attitudes and practices. Even the rise of Macedon and the Hellenistic period brought about subtle shifts in social norms and sexual mores. It's a complex tapestry woven with threads of desire, power, societal expectation, and individual expression. What makes studying ancient Greek sexuality so compelling, I think, is how it forces us to confront our own biases, our own assumptions about what is natural or normal. Their world, so different from ours in so many ways, challenges us to examine our own cultural constructs and to question the seemingly immutable truths we hold dear. They didn't necessarily have the same labels or categories that we use today. The very concepts of homosexuality and heterosexuality as fixed identities didn't exist in the same way. Instead, actions, roles, and social context often mattered more than the gender of one's partner. But what about the lasting impact? Why does all of this even matter today? Well, for starters, the ancient Greeks laid the foundations for much of Western civilization. Their philosophies, their art, their literature, their political systems, they all continue to influence us in profound ways. And their views on sexuality, though often unsettling or even offensive by modern standards, have also shaped our own understanding of love, desire, and the human body. Think about the enduring power of Greek mythology. The stories of Zeus and Hera, of Aphrodite and Ares, of all the gods and goddesses and their tumultuous relationships, still resonate with us. They've been retold and reinterpreted countless times, influencing everything from our art and literature to our music and movies. And in a more subtle way, the ancient Greeks' fascination with the human form, their idealization of beauty, that continues to shape our aesthetic sensibilities. But perhaps the most significant impact lies in the realm of ideas. The ancient Greeks grappled with fundamental questions about human nature, about the relationship between body and soul, about the nature of love and desire. Their philosophical inquiries, particularly those of Plato and Aristotle, laid the groundwork for centuries of Western thought on these topics. Even when we disagree with their conclusions, we're still engaging with the questions they first posed. Studying ancient Greek sexuality also provides a valuable perspective on the history of power and inequality. The restrictions placed upon women, the prevalence of slavery, the social hierarchies that governed relationships, these were all realities of ancient Greek life, and they had a profound impact on sexual dynamics. By understanding these inequalities, we can gain a deeper appreciation for the ongoing struggle for equality and social justice in our own time. So as we close this chapter, let's not simply admire the ancient Greeks for their artistic achievements or their philosophical insights. Let's also remember the complexities, the contradictions, and the sometimes uncomfortable truths about their society. Let's learn from their successes and their failures, and let's use that knowledge to create a more just and equitable world for all. Because in the end, history is not just about the past, it's about the present, and it's about the future. It's about understanding where we come from, so that we can better understand where we're going. And the story of ancient Greek sexuality, in all its messy, fascinating, and sometimes disturbing detail, is an essential part of that story. So thank you for joining me on this journey. I hope you found it as illuminating as I did. And until next time, sweet dreams, and maybe a little bit of ancient Greek mythology.